nights before the bloated body of Sir Boros Blount washed ashore on the jagged rocks near Sharp Point. There were no scorch marks on the body. Coward that he was, Blount likely jumped from the ship to escape the flames without a thought to try to save his king, and had drowned under the weight of his armor, leaving behind a waterlogged corpse and all the proof she needed to make her move. She had forced the small council to accept what they refused to, that Robert was dead. Stark had resisted, as she had expected he would, noble, cold, and utterly inflexible. She had plans to force the man's hand through his daughter, whose naivety made her easy to manipulate. Yet instead of doing as she told him to, Joffrey had instead ordered the execution of the entire Stark household. Instead of the potential of a peaceful surrender, it had led to the deaths of dozens, and was likely the cause of Barristan, another honorable fool, siding with Stark. The subsequent escape of Sansa and the Stark household from not only the Red Keep and King's Landing, but the Crown lands entirely, had deprived her of the hostage needed to bend Stark's knee. Now, the realm unraveled like a badly spun thread. Her father had swept through the Riverlands with fire and iron, punishing those who dared capture a lion. Yet all his victories were undone when the bloody Northmen marched south, despite their lord being a hostage. Led by a boy of 16, the North had recaptured Jaime, destroyed not one but two armies, and had the west open to them. All the while, her father and his army sat at Harrenhal debating their next move. And as if that was not enough, both of Robert's brothers had declared themselves kings. Stannis, who hated her as much as he loved his own sense of duty, had the gall to proclaim Joffrey a bastard and demanded the throne as his by rights. But Stannis was rigid and no one who knew him had any love for the man. In the end, he lacked the manpower needed to win the throne. Renly was the greater insult. The pretty peacock had no right to the throne, but he smiled and pranced and called himself king regardless. Backed by the Reach and its vast harvest of swords, Renly's defiance was more dangerous than Stannis's justice. And still the lords flocked to him, beguiled by his charm and his banners, as if royalty were a matter of smiles and tourneys rather than blood and fire. To make matters worse, the neutral regions had refused to declare for Joffrey. Dorne remained silent behind its red mountains. The Vale, guarded by that simpering woman Lysa, did nothing. Even the Ironborn, who should have feared her father's wrath, watched and waited from their black shores. Traitors and cowards the lot of them. Tyrion, of course, had proposed solutions as if he were the true hand of the king. He spoke of alliances, as if such things were easily bartered. Worst of all, the little monster wanted to use her children to secure those alliances. He spoke of fostering Tommen in the Vale with Jon Arryn's weak spawn, and betrothing Myrcella with Doran Martell's second son. As if she did not just get her children back from the months they had spent away from her side at the orders of Robert. Cersei looked Tyrion in his mismatched eyes when she told him where he could shove his ideas for her children. She already allowed her deformed brother too much leeway, but she would not allow him to insult her so. Even after all she had suffered and all she had done, there were still moves she had to make. Tyrion had that foul-mouthed sellsword and others hired to help him. So she sought her own, sending her cousin Lancel out into the city to find her some. As she descended the stone steps of Maegor's Hold Fast toward the inner courtyard, the clink of armor and the scent of oiled leather greeted her. Sir Osmond Kettleblack stood with his brothers Osney and Osfryd, bickering over a sack of coin and the affections of a washerwoman. They were tall, lean men, with the swagger of sellswords and the ambition of common-born thugs who had dressed themselves in knightly lies. They were rough and crude, but also pliable and eager. Most of all, they were each skilled with a sword. Or so she was told. That made them useful. Sir Osmond, she said, letting her voice cut through the morning air like a blade. The brothers turned at once, surprised, then bowing low. Osmond straightened with a smile that showed too many teeth. Your Grace, he said smoothly. To what do we owe the honor? She approached slowly, hands folded before her. You're not a knight. He blinked, unsure. Your Grace, I was knighted by. She waved her hand in a dismissive gesture, cutting him off. Lancel had told her Sir Osmond claimed he had been knighted while he served in a sellsword company in Essos, and it just so happened that the knight who did the deed was dead. All very convenient that there was no way to verify what Sir Osmond claimed, so they all just had to take him at his word. She had never seen the man before in any of the tourneys she had attended, so she very much doubted his knighthood. You're a sellsword dressed in borrowed armor. A liar. A whoremonger. She stopped inches from him and met his eyes, steady as steel. And that is exactly why I need you. He swallowed, the corner of his mouth twitching into something between amusement and caution. Your Grace. I have no use for honor, she said. Honor is what gets men killed. Her smile was thin. I need men who do as they are told. Men who understand that loyalty is a coin, and I pay better than any other. Osmond tilted his head. And what would you have us do, my queen? She turned to pace in front of them, their eyes following her every move. I need men loyal to me. I need eyes and ears and blades. I need men who will watch and listen, and will act when I say. The youngest of them grinned. She didn't know which of the other two was Osney and which was Osfried. Like dogs. Like lions, she corrected, tracing a finger along the lion-shaped clasp at her collar. You will wear red and gold cloaks. You will serve the king, as all in the realm should, but you will serve me first. Osmond exchanged glances with his brothers, then knelt. Command us, your grace. His brothers followed his lead, dropping to one knee. They would guard her children, follow her orders, and, if she ordered it, silence her enemies. Unlike the king's guard, who too often remembered their oaths and could balk at certain orders, she knew just by looking at them that the Kettle Blacks did not hold to such oaths. She looked down at him and smiled. For now, go back to whatever inn you stay at, but tomorrow come back here in the morning where you will be presented with your new cloaks. After which you will take posts in the Tower of the Hand. There are too many rats in Tyrion's walls. The middle brother dared to chuckle. Shall we kill them, or just listen? For now, listen. Later. She let the implication hang. They dipped their heads in an unspoken understanding. She turned and began walking back toward the keep, leaving the three brothers to stay kneeling as she left. Let Tyrion prattle about fostering and alliances and playing the game. Soon he would learn that he was nothing more than a minor piece, and that she, Cersei Lannister, was the Game of Thrones. Chapter 43, Robb 11. Robb 11. Robb Stark rode slowly through the sprawling camp, grey wind padding silently at his side. It was his job to make sure the camp was being set up with proper defenses, sharp stakes, trenches deep enough to slow any cavalry charge, and wagons and carts positioned for makeshift barricades. Although the folly had been to his benefit, Oxcross had taught him a valuable lesson when it came to setting up one's camp the right way, as well as making sure there was an adequate guard at night. Drive it deeper, came a bellow from beside him. Great Jon Umber, his massive frame looming in the saddle, was glaring down at two men who were struggling to anchor a stake into the earth. The wood wobbled with every strike, the pair red-faced with exertion. This isn't the north, the Great Jon barked. The ground here's softer than your Mars tits. The men froze, uncertain whether to laugh or look away in shame. With a grunt of disgust, Great Jon dismounted and stalked over. He seized the wooden stake in his meaty hands and, with a roar, drove it deep into the ground in one swift motion. There you go, you soft cunts, he muttered, brushing his hands together. Robb couldn't help but smile. Great Jon grumbled as he mounted his horse again, muttering something about weak rivermen. Sarsfield sat halfway between Casterly Rock and the Golden Tooth. It was an unremarkable castle save for its perch above the river road. It loomed on a slope, with steep mountains at its back, that made any full encirclement of the walls risky. One misstep in the wrong spot could send a man tumbling to his death. Still, the castle could be taken with sufficient numbers. Numbers that Robb intended to have. With any luck, Jon had secured the Golden Tooth as planned and was already marching to meet him with the bulk of the infantry. Together, their combined forces would number close to 9,000. More than enough to break Sarsfield and give their forces an uncontested path between the Riverlands and the Westerlands. A rider approached at speed, and Robb turned in his saddle as the gallop drew nearer. "My lord!" Oliver Free called out, reining in his horse beside him. Robb halted, raising a hand to quiet those around him as Oliver drew close. His squire reached into his doublet and produced 3 folded letters. "Riders from the Golden Tooth arrived, my lord. They bring tidings, and letters for you." Robb took the letters carefully. "What of the Golden Tooth?" "They bring good news, I hope." Oliver nodded. They said the tooth was taken a se'night ago, with minimal casualties. Jon Snow captured the Lady Lefford himself, after defeating her master-at-arms in single combat. The infantry marches to meet you here, as you ordered. Relief bloomed in Robb's chest. Another victory. Not just for himself, but for Jon too. Good. That's well done. He examined the letters. 2 of them had broken seals, one with the Tully Trout and the other bearing the direwolf of House Stark, though the grey wax had been applied over what looked to be green. The third was sealed with gold wax, pressed not by a signet ring but a simple thumb. He read quickly. The first letter, from his uncle Ed Muir, brought unwelcomed news. In his grief over learning of his son's death, Rickard Karstark had murdered 2 Tully guards and Sir Cleosfrey, one of their prisoners, all within Riverrun's walls. He'd been caught in the act. Now Rickard and the men who aided him were imprisoned. Both his foster brother, Harry on Karstark, and his uncle Ed Muir thought it best to have Robb cast judgment on his foster father. The second letter chilled him. Though from Winterfell, the flowery language was not the way of a northerner. It was from Renly Baratheon. Within, Renly spoke of taking Robb's younger brother Bran into his custody as a ward. He had allegedly sought sanctuary in Highgarden. Renly, in all his self-proclaimed gallantry, swore to protect the boy until he could be safely returned to Winterfell. Beneath the flowery words was handwriting he recognized from his childhood lessons, Maester Luwin's tidy scrawl. Renly has declared himself king. He is backed by the Reach. That was information they already knew, but it was clear what Maester Luwin was trying to say. Robb felt his jaw tighten as he unfolded the final letter. This one was from Jon. Apologetic, as ever, for opening the missives meant for Robb, but also pragmatic. He had read the letters to gauge their urgency and agreed with Robb's assessment. Bran hadn't sought out Renly, Renly had taken Bran as a hostage. There was no other way to see it. And Jon would not let it stand. He was riding south, with Smalljon and a hand-picked force of men. Robb closed the letter, his face set in grim resolve. The war was changing. The enemy no longer wore only crimson and gold. Grey Wind growled low beside him, sensing his master's unease. Robb reached down and scratched behind his ear. Grim news. Greatjon asked, eyeing Grey Wind warily as he flexed his left hand, short a finger thanks to the direwolf. Lord Karstark killed some Tully men and a Lannister prisoner in revenge for his son's death. Renly Baratheon has taken my brother Bran as a hostage, and both Jon and Smalljon ride to his rescue. More honor than sense, your brother Greatjon muttered. Luckily Smalljon is there to be the voice of reason. Robb gave a weak smile in response. It was true Jon had inherited their father's sense of honor more than Robb and any of their other siblings. Yet he doubted an Umber could ever be considered the voice of reason. What are you to do? Asked Mage Mormont, her voice gruff as ever from the far side of the Greatjon. She leaned forward in her saddle, eyes fixed on Robb. I must ride back to Riverrun, he said, his tone level but firm, to dispense justice upon Lord Karstark. Frowns were shared by the Northmen around him. Rickard Karstark was one of theirs, and he had only killed a Lannister, which was one of the reasons they had rode south, but the killing of a noble prisoner under their protection was an affront to the gods. But first Robb continued, his gaze shifting toward the stone silhouette of Sarsfield atop its ridge. This siege must end. Before I go, I will see this castle taken, one way or another. He turned back to Mage and Greatjon. Have my battle guard assembled. And see that one of the men finds a white flag. 15 minutes later, Robb sat astride his horse before the main gate of Sarsfield, the white banner fluttering limply in the still morning air. On his left rode the Greatjon and on his right was Lord Cale Vance. Behind Robb stood his personal retinue, 20 Stark men-at-arms in their polished grey armor and a dozen nobles, Theon Greyjoy, Dacey Mormont, Torrhen Karstark, Owen Norrie, Roderick Forrester, Hoarfrost Umber, Morgan Liddell, Lucas Blackwood, Sir Patrick Mallister, Sir Mark Piper, Oliver Free, and Sir Pewin Free. Above them, the walls of Sarsfield loomed, lined with archers and crossbowmen. Their bows were at rest, but every hand was near a string, every gaze alert. Opposite Robb stood Sir Hoar Sarsfield, brother to the lord of the castle. He wore his armor well, though his face showed signs of strain. Is this parley your way of offering your surrender? Sir Hoar asked, with a thin smile. The humor was there, but it rang hollow. Gratian let out a deep, echoing guffaw. Ha! Only if the boys come mad. Rob's voice cut clean through the morning air. No, Sir Hoa. I've come to receive your surrender. Your brother, Lord Melwyn, is already my prisoner at Riverrun. I command 400 to 600 men here, and 4,000 more march now from the Golden Tooth. You cannot hold against those odds. Sir Hoa thumped a mailed fist against his breastplate. This may be true, but 5 of yours will die for every one of mine. Rob kept his face blank. His eyes remained locked on the knights. And if that happens, he said quietly, my men will be blooded and raw with grief and rage. It will be difficult to hold them back. I'm sure you've stormed a castle before, Sir Hoa. Perhaps against the Greyjoys, maybe even joining Lord Tywine in his taking of King's Landing all those years ago. You know what men are like when they storm a place. The walls fall, and their fury looks for something to devour. Sir Hoa's face paled. What are you insinuating? Rob shook his head. I'm not insinuating. I'm warning. I will not allow a sack, but should you force me to storm your gates, there may come a moment when I cannot control every single one of my men who storm the walls. You may hold your honor, but what of your people? Your garrison? The women and children who have no say in whether you open that gate. He leaned forward in the saddle. But if you yield to me now, if you lay down your arms and open your gates, I give you my word. No harm will come to those inside. On my honor, as a Stark. The man stared back at Rob, and must not have liked what he saw. He winced and shook his head. I must think on this. Of course. Take the night. If I do not hear from you by midday tomorrow, I will take that as your refusal to surrender, and will act accordingly. Sir Hoa did not need the night. He surrendered the castle before the sun had fully set. Walking into Sarafield's great hall, where every person inside the castle had gathered, Rob saw that not only were Lord Melwyn's 2 sons inside the castle, but also Sir Hoa's 3 children. You made the right decision, Rob assured the knight. There are things greater than a man's honor and pride, and the safety of those under his protection is one of those things. Sir Hoa kept his gaze on the floor, his shame at surrendering the castle not eased by Rob's words. Rob ascended the dais with measured steps. Sir Mark Piper already stood on it, tall and composed. Behind him the banner of House Piper was held aloft by one of his men. Rob had chosen Sir Mark to hold Sarsfield in his name, and he would do so with 150 men who served House Piper. Below them, the great hall of Sarsfield was packed near to bursting. 223 fighting men, stripped of their weapons and armor, stood shoulder to shoulder with a dozen castle servants and their families. Members of House Sarsfield lingered near the rear, flanked by armed rivermen and Northmen who lined the perimeter with watchful eyes and steel at the ready. The air was tense. Though the castle had been thoroughly searched, Rob had insisted on a final sweep. He would allow no hidden swords. He had given his word that no harm would come to those within the castle walls if Sir Hoa yielded. He would hate to have to break that promise because someone fashioned themselves a hero in their own mind. As long as you do not harm us, Sir Mark spoke, voice ringing clearly through the hall, no harm shall befall you. He swept the hall with a calm, steady gaze. Those of you who dwell in the lands around the castle, return to your homes and your families. Those who live within these walls, resume your lives. There is no more war for you. With the heir to Pink Maiden firmly in control and some of the tension beginning to drain from the room, Rob stepped down from the dais and quietly withdrew from the hall, heading for the camp pitched beyond the walls. His command tent awaited him there. Without a word, a handful of guards fell into step behind him. The cold air outside bit sharper than the stale heat of the hall, but Rob welcomed it. He needed a clear head. Inside the canvas of the command tent, the air buzzed with anticipation. Seated around the central map table were the important lords and commanders who still rode with him, and weren't leading one of the other numerous armies he had that marched the Riverlands. Gratian and Mage, as well as Galbart Glover, Helman Tallheart and Robin Flint from the north. From the Riverlands was Lord Cale Vance, Sir Ryman Free, Sir Walton Free, and Sir Patrick Mallister. As always, Theon stood apart from the rest, watching them with a detached, aloof gaze. Rob took a brief moment to study them. Besides Theon, Vance and Mallister were closest to him in age, yet both had nearly a decade on him. and yet it was he they waited for. He took his seat at the head of the table. On the morrow he began as soon as he sat, I ride for Riverrun, with my battle guard at my back. The tent rustled with murmurs, though none interrupted. They knew why he rode to Riverrun and that his decision there could irreparably damage the relationship with a faction of their army. In my absence, Robb continued, his voice hardening, the war does not stop. I leave it to you to teach Lord Tywin Lannister and the Westerlands a lesson they won't soon forget. That earned a round of hoots from the Northern Lords. The River Lords exchanged eager grins and satisfied nods. With both the Golden Tooth and Sussfield in our hands, the river road lies open between the Riverlands and the Westerlands. Save for one place, Oxcross. It is where the road exits the mountains and enters the heart of the West. If we want to keep this lifeline open, we must return to Oxcross, fortify it, and hold it fast. He reached for a marker and placed it on the map beside the narrow pass and its nearby village. The cavalry from the Riverlands, along with the infantry marching from the Tooth, will be split into 4 commands. Sir Ryman Free will begin fortifying Oxcross. That pass must become a fortress. Sir Walton, he looked directly at the younger Free, you will assist him. I want eyes on that task. Clear ones. Sir Ryman gave a lazy nod, either not caring at Robb's rebuke against him and his drinking or not understanding it, while Walton simply dipped his head in acknowledgement. The remaining commands go to Sir Patrek, Lord Kael, and Black Walder, who leads the foot here. You are to raid the lands and villages around Lannisport and Casterly Rock, as well as Case, Feast Fires, and Greenfield. The keeps are too well defended, so avoid them at all costs. He placed horse markers down on the land around those keeps. Lord Kael leaned forward and studied the map. Sir Patrek nodded in understanding, a pleased smile on his face. I will divide the northern cavalry into 2 raiding parties. Gratian and Lord Hellman, you'll take one half. Lady Mage and Lord Robin, the other. Ride along the coast into the northern Westerlands and strike fast. Burn out their granaries, raid their supply lines, but avoid the larger keeps. He pointed toward Nuns Deep, Banefort, and Ashmark. You'll have limited numbers. Choose your targets wisely. Robb leaned forward, his voice low and cold. Take what you must. But spare the small folk where you can. Let them know who is truly to blame for their suffering. Let them curse Tywin Lannister's name. They passed Black Walder and his infantry on the ride back to Riverrun. The column was still a 3 days' march from Sussfield, slowed down by the wagons that travelled with them. Robb passed along to Black Walder the same orders he had told the others. While he found Sir Ryman's second son unsavoury, the man had a head for tactics and was good with a sword. Robb's battle guard was several men shorter than it was in his first battle. Denys Hornwood and Edward Carstark were killed at the Battle of the Whispering Wood. Sir Daemon Vipren had joined Ed Muir's force marching on Harrenhal. Sir Mark Piper was now in charge of Sussfield, while Sir Patrek Mallister raided the Westerlands. Then there was Jon and Smalljan riding off to rescue Bran. On the 3rd day of their ride, the late afternoon sun sat high above them as Robb nudged his horse closer to Theon's. He glanced over at his boyhood friend, who carried his usual smirk, though it had dulled around the edges. They had been riding in silence for a while, the rhythmic clop of hooves their only company. I should have given you a command, Robb said, breaking the silence. You earned it at the Whispering Wood and Oxcross. And I said I would. You had every right to expect one. Theon turned his head, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he let out a low chuckle and shook his head. You didn't have to. You don't owe me anything. I made you a promise. You did. But truth be told, Theon said, resting a hand casually on the pommel of his sword, I'd rather ride with you than be off with some bannermen who resent taking orders from a Greyjoy. Robb frowned. You're as much a Stark as you are a Greyjoy. Theon looked down at his breastplate, where the Kraken of House Greyjoy was etched into the armor, and chuckled, the sound dry. I spent half my life in Winterfell, but that doesn't change who I am. You'd be amazed how many men think I'll betray you in your sleep. I don't, Robb answered, voice firm. You shouldn't, Theon replied. I've bled for House Stark. I'll do it again. On the morning of the 4th day, as the retinue wound its way beneath the looming shadow of the highest mountain peak to the south, Robb eased his horse into a slower pace until he was riding alongside Lucas Blackwood. The second son of Lord Blackwood bore the height of his lineage. He was nearly as tall as Smallgen, but he lacked the bulk. He was all limbs, and reminded Rob of a freshly birthed foal first learning to walk. A year Rob's junior, he carried the unmistakable stamp of his house, dark hair, pale skin, and the hooked nose of his father, Lord Tytos. "How does Brindon fare?" Rob asked. "I did not have much of a chance to speak with him at Riverrun." Lucas looked over, surprised by the question, then smiled faintly. "For battle. He is anxious. For his fast approaching marriage to your sister. He is very nervous." Rob laughed. "He should be. Sansa is as stubborn as any of us. I know they have written to each other a few times, but I know not what was said. If she wants to know any truth about my brother, tell her when he sleeps he sounds like a dying boar." Rob smiled, but the warmth in his expression faded slightly. "I have not seen my sister in almost 2 years. She left Winterfell a girl who dreamed she would marry one of the heroes in those songs she loves so much. I wonder what sort of woman she's had to grow into since then, and at what cost." Lucas gave a nod, more solemn now. "It's a good match, Rob. She'll be well cared for. He might not be a hero, but Brindon has always been steady. Thoughtful. He won't shame her." "I'm glad to hear it," Rob replied, then added more softly, "Sansa deserves peace. She'll find peace in Brindon, I swear it. Though maybe not so much at night with his snoring." Rob made a point to speak with each the other noble members of his guard, not just as their lord but as their companion on the march. Morgan Liddell and Owen Norrie, both broad-shouldered second sons of their respective mountain clans, were as gruff as any hillman Rob had ever known. With thick beards and loud laughs they lived as if each day might be their last. Drinking, fighting, and rutting were their passions, and they saw no shame in boasting about them around the campfires, especially to anyone who shared a cup of ale with them. Despite their crudeness, or perhaps because of it, Rob found them strangely comforting in their honesty. They were simple men, but loyal and brave, and that counted for much in war. Roderick Forrester was more reserved. The heir to Ironrath, his family's stronghold in the Wolfswood, Roderick kept his own counsel, content to observe conversations from the sidelines rather than take part in them. House Forrester were loyal vassals of House Glover, renowned for their expertise in harvesting and working ironwood, a rare and valuable timber. Rob remembered hearing that Roderick's younger brother, Asher, had been exiled across the narrow sea for drawing blood in a feud with another northern house over the lord's daughter. Roderick didn't speak of his brother often, but when he did, there was only regret. He also expressed quiet concern for his sister, Myra, who had gone south to serve as a handmaiden for Margaery Tyrell. It was a prestigious position, no doubt, but to those in the north, the southern courts were filled with serpents. Daisy Mormont, by contrast, had no time for brooding. Though she spent much time bemoaning her mother's latest efforts to marry her off. This time it was to Sir Ellery Vance, the third son of Lord Norbert Vance of Atranta. It was just the latest in a long line of matches Lady Mage had tried to arrange over the past 10 years, all of them met with flat refusals or thinly veiled insults. Daisy, as the eldest of her mother's 5 daughters, was the heir to Bear Island, and everyone expected her to wed and produce an heir of her own. But Daisy had other priorities, the biggest of which was leading House Mormont's warriors in battle. Rob chuckled at the thought of anyone trying to tame a storm like Daisy Mormont. The journey back to Riverrun had them stopping at the Golden Tooth and Wayfarer's Rest before they finally arrived at his uncle's castle, the sun beginning to set behind the western mountains. Sir Desmond Grill, a stout and aging knight whose belly preceded him wherever he walked, was waiting in the courtyard as they dismounted. He had been appointed Castellan while Uncle Edmure was away. "Lord Rob!" Sir Desmond shouted as they dismounted their horses in the courtyard. "We received news of your coming from Sarsfield. I was not aware lions had wings, for you've put them to flight." A cheer went up from the Tully Guards and his battle guard. Rob bowed his head in acknowledgement of the praise. "A letter arrived from Winterfell the other day," Sir Desmond continued in a quieter voice. "It is in the Lord Solar." "Thank you, Sir Desmond, but I rode back for a specific purpose, and I must pass judgment before I can attend anything else." The old knight granted his approval. "I'll have Lord Karstark brought for your judgment." 20 minutes later, Rob sat at the head table in the Great Hall of Riverrun. He did not sit in the Lord's seat, as that was his uncle's chair, even if he was not there. Instead he sat to the right of it. To the left of the Lord's chair sat Sir Desmond, as well as the castle's Maester, Vimon. On the other side of Rob were Theon, Dacey Mormont, and Morgan Liddell. All chosen because they were the heirs to their houses, as though Morgan was the second son. His older brother Duncan had joined the Night's Watch. Lord Carstark was led into the room with 4 other men from the north, each of them large men with weary faces and greying beards. All of their wrists were bound together with rope. They were escorted by 10 of the Tully Guard, spears clutched tightly in their hands. Rob looked to the back of the hall, where Torrhen stood. The teen, a year younger than Rob, stood with arms crossed over his chest as he watched the proceedings with a blank face. He was without his armor and his sword, which had been required if he wanted to attend these proceedings. It was not that Rob did not trust his foster brother, but people overwhelmed by grief could act impulsively. 5 Rob said when the prisoners stood before him. Is that all of them? There were 8. Sir Demond rumbled next to him. 3 were killed taking them prisoner. It took 8 of you to kill an unarmed prisoner. They murdered 2 of our men to get into the tower, Sir Desmond added with a scowl. Delp and Elwood. It was not murder, Sir Ricard Carstark said, showing no discomfort from the ropes around his wrists. Any man who steps between a father and his vengeance, asks for death. I saw Eddard die in the Whispering Wood. Cleosfrey did not kill him. How then can you call this vengeance? This was folly and bloody murder. Your son died honorably on a battlefield with a sword in his hand. He died, Lord Carstark said, yielding no inch. The Kingslayer cut him down, but I could not get to the Kingslayer. This one was of his ilk. Only blood can pay for blood. They had the Kingslayer under much heavier protection compared to the other prisoners. He was secluded in a separate tower, behind a heavy wooden door that was always locked, with 5 men standing guard at all times. Previously, it was Edmure who had the key and was the one who allowed the servants to bring the Kingslayer his 2 meals a day. Likely, that key and task had been passed to Sir Desmond. With a prisoner of not only the Kingslayer's skill, but his importance, they took no chances, and it seemed they were right to do so. Rob remembered they had 2 other prisoners with Lannister blood, Willem Lannister and Shenfrey, Cleo's younger brother. Both were only squires, maybe 13 or 14 years old. He supposed it was a small miracle Lord Carstark did not take his need for vengeance out on a child. Cleosfrey surrendered his sword. He was a prisoner. My prisoner. Under my protection until such a time where he was ransomed, released, or had judgment passed upon him. And you murdered him. He was a Lannister, Carstark growled. If not by name, then by blood. In war, we kill our enemies. Didn't your father teach you that? Rob's jaw clenched. There was some truth in the words, but not enough to outweigh the crime. He looked across the hall again, past the flickering torches and rows of stern faces, to Torrhen. His foster brother had not moved an inch. Rob wished he could read his face, to know what Torrhen thought of all this. I owe you more than most, Lord Carstark, Rob said at last, as he turned his attention back to the prisoners. 5 years I spent in your halls. You helped teach me to hunt, to ride, to wield a sword. Your hall was my second home. I loved your son. He died a brave man, and I grieved for him as I would a brother. Ricard said nothing. And still you defied me. You broke the laws of the realm. You broke faith with me. I cannot excuse murder, no matter the blood, no matter the grief. Carstark's lips curled. Are you going to kill me then? After I raised you as my own for 5 years. I am not my father, Rob said. And you are not so lucky. Rob stood from his chair. The murmuring of the crowd, which had served as a background noise to the proceedings, died down. Ricard Carstark, you and your surviving men are guilty of the murder of Cleosfrey, a sworn prisoner under my protection. The laws of the North and the South both call for death as the price for murder. But I will not spill Carstark blood in Riverrun's halls. He looked directly at Ricard now. You are not a traitor to me, but you are a murderer, and for that there is still one path left to you. He nodded to Sir Desmond. You and your men will take the Black. You will ride for the wall under guard and swear your oaths to the Night's Watch. Should any of you resist, or attempt escape, your heads will decorate the gates of the nearest castle. Is that understood? Karstark's mouth twisted in disdain. You would exile me like some common thief. I offer you mercy, Robb said evenly. A man might find redemption at the wall. Or die with honor defending the realm. Chapter 44, Bran V and Jon X. Bran V. Bran and Sir Robar stood atop a grassy hill that overlooked the expanse of the battlefield below, a wide, rolling plain that dropped abruptly into jagged cliffs to the south and east, where the churning waters of Shipbreaker Bay smashed against the rocks far below. Storm's End loomed like a shadow at the edge of the world, its massive black curtain walls and squat towers cutting a grim silhouette against the overcast sky. The fortress cast a somber pall over the field, as if the castle itself disapproved of the blood soon to be spilled between brothers. Renly Baratheon's host stretched across the northern edge of the plain, a shimmering mass of horse and steel. His entire army was cavalry, their colorful banners flapping in the wind. Sir Robar leaned forward, pointing with a gloved hand as he explained the arrangement to Bran. At this distance it was hard to distinguish the finer details, but Robar's practiced eye saw what Bran could not. The skirmishers lead. Light cavalry for speed and maneuvering. Behind them, 3 main wedges of heavy horse, left, center, and right. Each bears similar strength in number and weight, he said. And there, at the rear, Renly keeps his reserve. A mix of light and heavy cavalry. He likely intends to commit them where the line begins to buckle, or to flank Stannis' forces. Bran squinted, trying to make sense of the formations as Robar described them. The colorful surcoats and plumes were hard to tell apart from so far away. Across the field, in stark contrast, stood the grim and disciplined lines of Stannis Baratheon's force. His army looked to be thousands less and was made almost entirely of infantry, arranged in tight blocks that bristled with spears and pikes. Archers were arrayed in front, already loosing volleys into the air. The infantry was organized in 3 solid formation, left, right, and center. The first few ranks were trained soldiers, armored and armed with pikes and long spears with broad shields. Behind them came the small folk levies, clad in rough spun and leather, wielding crude weapons, pitchforks, clubs studded with nails, and rusted flails. Bran's eyes drifted to the flanks, where 2 smaller bands of cavalry waited behind Stannis' line. Sir Robar traced a hand in the air as he gestured to them. There, he said. Stannis holds his cavalry in reserve, 1 detachment behind each flank. That's his banner, the crowned stag in black and yellow on the right. He rides with them himself. Then he pointed to another standard, this one bearing the crowned stag but in green and gold, the colors of House Tyrell rather than Baratheon proper. And Renly rides with his reserve. Easier to see the battle as it unfolds in front of him, and allows him to commit them when needed, or to flee if things do not go his way. Bran gave a small nod. Though they were both prisoners of Renly, Sir Robar still had him fulfill his duties as a page and never passed up a chance to teach him. Bran found himself grateful for it, especially now, with a real battle unfolding before his eyes. Stannis was a fool to march here, muttered Sir Humphrey, arms crossed, his face sour with disapproval. He's always been too stubborn for his own good, Sir Adam agreed, his tone grim. Bran cast a sideways glance at the 3 knights assigned to watch him, Sir Humphrey, Sir Adam, and the much quieter Sir Raynaud. All 3 had their eyes fixed on the field below, faces tight with tension as the first real movements of battle began. Stannis' archers let fly another volley, a dark cloud of arrows arcing skyward before raining down upon Renly's skirmishers. In response, the light cavalry surged forward, hooves tearing across the field in a blur of motion. But it was a feint, or perhaps a mistake. They darted forward, loosing javelins and arrows of their own, but quickly found themselves overextended. The archers retreated behind the infantry line in good order, who let them pass before assembling with shields raised. Most of Renly's light horse managed to wheel away and retreat before crashing into the infantry line, but not all. Dozens of riders lost control or misjudged their turn, plowing straight into the wall of spears and shields. Screams rose above the din as men were pulled from saddles, trampled, or skewered, their charge shattered before it ever truly began. With the lead cavalry racing back to Renly's lines, the archers came forward again and released another volley into the backs of the retreating skirmishers. The next volley loosed was aimed at the heavy horse themselves, and while a lot of them wore heavy plate that deflected the arrows, their horses had no such protection. Some horses collapsed, others reared at the pain. Renly must have given some command because his main line of heavy cavalry began to move forward, working their way up to a gallop. Stannis' archers let loose one more volley before fleeing back behind their infantry line. The thunder of hooves echoed up the hillside like distant drums. Bran watched with wide eyes as the front lines engaged. Renly's heavy cavalry charging forward in unison. The ground trembled beneath their advance, an awe-inspiring sight. But Sir Robar didn't flinch. His eyes tracked the movement with calm calculation. Stannis' front lines held steady. The men braced, a forest of spear points awaiting the oncoming wave. As Renly's cavalry crashed into the line, a terrible sound rose from the field, screams, steel against wood, the snapping of lances and bones alike. The charge broke through in places, but only at great cost. Horses reared, impaled. Men were thrown from their saddles or pulled down by infantry, only to be finished off with axe or spear. But Renly had numbers on his side, and he pressed the advantage. His center surged forward, crushing into Stannis' line. The knights fought with the fury of pride and ambition, but, as Sir Robar pointed out several times, cavalry lost a lot of its benefits stationary and pressed together like it was. Stannis' forces bent but did not break. The discipline of his men was apparent even from a distance. Where Renly's knights fought with flamboyance and individual glory, Stannis' infantry fought like soldiers, precise, unrelenting, silent save for their grunts and the clash of weapons. His flanking cavalry swept forward in measured strikes, harassing Renly's flanks but never overcommitting. "Stannis is bleeding him slow," Sir Robar muttered, almost with admiration. "No wild charges. Just pressure. Pressure and attrition." "Will Stannis win?" Bran asked. Sir Robar did not answer immediately. His jaw clenched. "Not unless something changes." It took almost half an hour, but something did change. Far beyond the edge of the battlefield, at the rear of Renly's formation, movement stirred where there should have been none. A new column of riders and infantry emerged from the woods flanking the eastern cliffs, their banners low and their formation tight. They came from behind Renly's host, not Stannis. Bran leaned forward. "Who are they?" Bran asked. "Those aren't Tyrells," Sir Adam said sharply. "Sellswords," Sir Rhaenyra growled. "Stannis brought them ashore in secret." Bran glanced out past the cliffs and to the waters beyond, where small fuzzy blobs bobbed in the water, Stannis' ships. After luring Renly into battle, the older brother must have had several of his ships bring ashore the men who now moved on Renly's rear. Sir Robar explained that there should have been a rearguard watching for such a thing, and either hadn't been set by Renly's inexperienced commanders or they had all been killed. The riders fell upon Renly's reserves with barely a warning. They wore no heraldry, but their equipment was well maintained, and their movements too coordinated for bandits. Men died screaming in the rear lines as panic rippled forward. The sudden assault broke the cohesion of Renly's host. The reserves, led by Renly himself, wheeled to meet the threat. The sellsword cavalry were a third the size of Renly's reserve, but the infantry that marched behind them, and would join in the fighting in minutes, would tip the numbers into the sellsword's favor. The sellsword infantry split into two, allowing their cavalry to hold the enemy in position, while they moved to encircle. With Renly's reserve being pinned as it was, Stannis' two cavalry forces made wide arcing turns and crashed into the side of Renly's line. In the center, the Reach Knights redoubled their efforts, trying to punch through and regroup, but they found themselves surrounded on three sides. Stannis' infantry surged forward with renewed purpose, and the Knights of the Reach began to fall one by one. Bran saw Renly, or what he thought was Renly, trying to rally his men. A green-cloaked figure on a golden charger, his sword raised high. But the command structure had fractured, and with it, the will to fight. Men began to flee. First in small clusters, then by the dozens. Horses galloped free of their riders, the wounded dragged themselves through the mud. Whatever gaps had not been plugged by Stannis' men were used to run from the battle. "It's done," Sir Humphrey said. "The field is lost." And indeed it was. The colorful banners of the Reach and Stormlords who backed the younger brother fell, one by one, to the trampled mud. "We should leave," Sir Robar voiced, grabbing Bran by the shoulder and steering him away from the site of the battle. Sir Rhaenyra stepped in their path, hand on the hilt of his sword. "Where do you think you're going?" "His Grace." "Lost the battle," Sir Robar barked out, cutting the man off. His men flee, as should we. Sir Adam stepped forward, placing a hand on Reynard's forearm. He's right. Most will rally to the camp. We can gather there. Sir Reynard gave a tight nod, jaw clenched as he turned back toward the hillside. Together, the small party moved with haste down the slope opposite the battlefield, boots thudding against the dry, patchy grass. At the bottom, where the trees thinned into rough scrub, their horses stood tied and restive, snorting and pawing at the ground as if they sensed the tension in the air. The camp was a few miles to the northwest of Storm's End, the ride to it feeling like an eternity. If the watchers had hoped to find clarity or leadership at camp, they found none. What they found was chaos. Tents collapsed in heaps as men clawed at the canvas, rummaging for valuables, food, or coin. Fights broke out between desperate soldiers, many of them wounded or blooded from the field, grappling and striking one another. The camp guard, a few hundred men left behind to protect what baggage brought, and maintain order, had given up trying. Some had joined the looting, while others stood frozen, dumbfounded by the rout of what had once been a king's host. And then, word had come. Renly Baratheon was dead. Not in single combat, nor in glorious duel against his brother, but cut down in the maelstrom by a nameless sellsword. What little order had existed in the camp before then disappeared at those words. Rather than turn toward their own modest section of the camp, not that they had anything of value, Sir Robar strode with purpose through the disorder. "Where are you going?" Sir Adam asked, hurrying to catch up. Sir Robar did not break stride. "To take back what is mine." "What?" "My sword and my armor. The steel they stripped from me at Bitterbridge." "You're not to hold a blade," Sir Adam said sharply, moving to block his path. "We have orders." "Orders?" Sir Robar echoed coldly, his eyes narrowing at someone blocking his path a second time. "From a man whose head now likely rests on the point of a pike." "There is no king. There are no orders." Now it was Sir Adam's hand that moved to his sword hilt. "There is still law. Still honor." "Honor." Robar spat the word like poison. "Is it honorable to let them take what was earned with blood and sweat because I would not bend the knee to a man who took hostage my page?" "Stand down, both of you," Sir Humphrey interjected, his voice unexpectedly firm. The youngest of the knights, his normally bright face was drawn, pale with grief. "Sir Robar is right. King Renly is dead. Our duty was to watch Bran, to keep him safe, and to keep him within the king's sight, yet now there is no king whose sight he needs to remain in. But we can still honor our oaths, we can still watch him and keep him safe." Sir Adam hesitated, hand still resting on his sword. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. Robar gave a sharp nod and pushed forward through the press of men. The tent was half collapsed, sagging on one side where the pole had been kicked loose. Inside, the remnants of Renly's court was a mess. A pair of cots were overturned and papers were scattered across the floor. A few garments, breeches and tunics with seams torn and ripped, likely from men fighting over them, lay discarded in crumpled heaps. Whatever items of value Renly had brought with him from Bitterbridge were gone, and that included Sir Robar's armor. Sir Robar cursed and kicked at one of the overturned cots in his anger, where something caught his eye. Under the cot was his sword, still in its scabbard. He picked it up with reverence, fingers wrapping around the hilt like a man remembering his own name. "Let's go," he said. "This place will not be safe for long." A sudden shout erupted from the southern edge of camp. Men turned. Some ran. Then came a second voice, high and panicked, "Gods, look at her." Brienne of Tarth stumbled into view, her blue cloak torn, her armor blooded and dented. One of her eyes was swollen shut, and her knuckles were scraped raw where she'd discarded her gauntlets. The sword she carried was slick with gore. "Brienne!" Bran cried with worry, moving towards her. She looked at him, but Bran doubted she actually saw him. Her eyes were glossy and filled with tears. She fell to her knees, sword clattering out of her hands. "Renly is dead," she whispered. "I tried to reach him in the fray but..." She broke off and sobbed bitterly, dirt-stained hands clutching at her face. "Lady Brienne, what of the army?" Sir Humphrey asked. "What of the rest of the Rainbow Guard sworn to protect the king?" She did not hear them. Bran reached out and pulled gently on her hands. Brian allowed them to be lowered from her face and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "What of the army and the Rainbow Guard?" Brian asked, repeating the question. "Stannis took the field. Sir Loras was badly wounded, I do not know if he lives. Sir Aemon is dead, I saw him fall. The rest were taken prisoner or surrendered." The last word was said with a snarl. "The Storm Lords are already bending the knee. As are some of the Reachmen, Crane, Meadows, the Fossoes. Stannis will come here before nightfall." Brian's eyes hardened. She grabbed her sword and climbed to her feet. "And I will be here ready for him." Bran gasped. "You'll die. I am righting a wrong. I should have died with my king," Brian stated, voice firm. "Lady Brian," Sir Robar said, stepping forward. "Before I could join this war, I tasked myself with bringing Bran back safely to his family, for he is too valuable a hostage to have with me in this war, as Lord Renly made abundantly clear." The others all flinched at Sir Robar's rebuke, even Brian. "I set out on that journey once more, and while I believe there will be more than just me," Sir Robar looked at the 3 Reach Knights, all of whom slowly nodded their heads, "we could always use another sword, especially one of your skill. Rather than forfeit your life here, come with us and help see Bran to safety." Brian did not look swayed by the words. Her gaze was to the south, where Stannis' army was no doubt marching their way at that very moment. Bran took Brian's off-hand in his own. She looked down at him, and he gave her his most pleading of looks. He could not bear to think of Brian dying here in this camp, fighting an army of thousands all by herself. "Please, Brian." She let out a heavy sigh. "I will help you bring Bran to safety." Jon X. It was near a small town called Tumblers Falls, on one of the headwater branches of the Blackwater Rush, that Jon and his party came upon Lord Tytos Blackwood and his men. They had set up camp a few nights ago and would likely camp there a few nights more. The village had been spared the worst of the war's wrath, though there were signs that they had not escaped wholly unscathed: the burned-out husk of a hut, the gutted remains of a small herd of cattle rotting in a field, the fresh piles of dirt to indicate newly dug graves. They were 5 days departed from the Golden Tooth. Almost 2 moons ago Tytos Blackwood, like his rival Jon Osbracken, had been given 800 swords by the combined command of Robb and Lord Ed Muir, and tasked with killing the Lannister-sanctioned bands that burned and pillaged the Riverlands, the Mountain, Amory Lork, and the Brave Companions. As night had descended upon the land, Lord Blackwood invited Jon, Smalljon, and Jon's squire, Brian Free, to join him by the fire. A wineskin made its slow, steady circuit between gloved hands. "We've crossed swords with Lork and the Bloody Mummers a few times," Blackwood said, his dark eyes glinting in the firelight, voice low and grave. "But every time they slipped away before we could crush them. Cowards the lot of them. Never stand and fight unless they smell weakness." Smalljon grunted, his thick fingers curling around the wineskin as it came to him. "How many men have you lost chasing these bastards?" "Near 200. Across the circle, Brian Free leaned forward, eyes wide in the flickering glow. "And the Mountain?" he asked, the name alone drawing a shiver of unease from some around the fire. Lord Blackwood gave a dismissive shrug, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "We've yet to lay eyes on that beast. Bracken wasn't so lucky. Had him cornered, they say. Outnumbered Clegane by near 300 men, but he still came away bloody and beaten, fleeing like a whipped dog." Lord Blackwood snorted in disgust, though there was some joy in Bracken's humiliation beneath it all. Jon was not so quick to mock Lord Bracken for his defeat. The Mountain was no ordinary knight. A man that size, with that strength, could tear through 50 foes alone. Perhaps the odds had not been so sharply in Lord Bracken's favor as Lord Blackwood wished to believe. Against Gregor Clegane numbers meant little unless they brought him low with the first strike. Otherwise, he would overwhelm you with his strength and reach. They departed from Lord Blackwood's camp the next morning, with 3 men at arms of House Blackwood, growing their numbers to 14, 15 if you counted Ghost. Lord Blackwood insisted on it, as a favor to the brothers of his future good daughter. Jon suspected it was meant more for Bran than himself, but he thanked the Lord nonetheless. Ghost served as their scout and guide, and no better guide could Jon have asked for in the wild hills of the Riverlands. Even the horses had grown used to Ghost's silent passage, their ears flicking nervously but their hooves steady as they followed the great white beast. It was near the bend where the Blackwater Rush curved east, a few days' ride from Tumbler's Fall, that Ghost proved his worth once more. The direwolf came to a sudden, rigid halt several yards ahead, his red eyes fixed on the unseen horizon. His body tensed. John's hand went to the pommel of his sword as he spurred his horse forward, closing the distance. Foreign men. Foreign beast. The thought came unbidden to John's mind, unspoken but clear, as if the wolf's instincts had brushed against his own. Ghost smelled something foul on the wind, men, many of them, and not river lords or Northmen. John's gaze swept the gentle rise to their east, his heart quickening. "We need to go now," he said sharply, turning in the saddle to address the others. His voice was low, urgent. No time for questions. Before anyone could voice their confusion or protest, John dug his heels into his horse's flanks, sending the beast leaping into a gallop. Ghost was already running, a white blur against the grass. "John!" Small Janumba bellowed behind him, but to his credit, the great man spurred his own horse without hesitation, charging after John. The others followed, their confusion turning to fear as they caught sight of what Ghost had scented. "The bloody mummers," one of Lord Blackwood's outriders cried, pale-faced, lashing at his horse to flee faster. The sight of them was something out of a fever dream. One man wore a jester's motley cap, its bells jingling wildly as he whooped and grinned. Another looked half dead, a gaunt corpse thing in yellowed mail, his skin grey and sunken. Among them he spotted a few Dothraki, copper-skinned and bare-chested, their hair braided and belled, the curved arrows flashing at their sides. He even spotted a rider astride a beast John had never seen before, a striped horse, fierce and lean as its rider. There must have been close to 200 in all. A Dothraki surged ahead of the rest, his bare chest crisscrossed with old scars. His braid swung behind him as he drove his mount forward, arrow pointed like a spear at the last of John's company. He was swift, faster than any man in either group, and if he reached the rear riders of John's men, he would cut them down before they could scatter. John could not allow that. He yanked hard on the reins, wheeling his horse away from Ghost's trail and into the Dothraki's path. He ignored the shouts of the others as they passed by him. With effort, he drew his longsword from its sheath, the steel flashing bright above his head. The Dothraki's shrill war cry, wild and guttural, filled the air. They charged headlong at each other, and for one terrible heartbeat John thought they would crash. At the last instant he turned his horse aside, feeling the wind of the arrow whistle past his cheek. Lucky for John, longswords were a few inches longer than arrows. His sword struck in that same moment, the tip biting deep into the Dothraki's chest, leaving a path of bloody ruin. The man screamed and tumbled sideways from the saddle, crashing hard to the earth. John did not pause to watch him fall. He wheeled his horse again, falling into line behind the others. Wisely, the rest of his company had followed Ghost's lead, racing down along the Blackwater's course, past the squat tower of the Rush that loomed to the east, deserted after the Lannisters stormed the walls and slaughtered the entire Lolliston household. Their destination was where the Gold Road crossed the Blackwater Rush and into the Reach, a few miles to the southeast. A sharp whistle cut through the wind, and an arrow struck the dirt just to John's left. Glancing back, he caught sight of one of the Dothraki riders surging ahead of the pack. The man rode with effortless grace, short curved bow in hand, knocking another arrow as smoothly as if he stood still rather than galloping at full speed. They really were as good as riders as the books said they were. John cursed under his breath and forced his horse into a zigzagging path, the animal lurching side to side beneath him to make him a harder target. Another arrow hissed past, thudding into the grass. Then another, this one much closer. The Dothraki archer was skilled. He was adjusting, reading John's movements. John tightened the zigzag, varying his rhythm, making it sharper, unpredictable, trying to spoil the man's aim. Ahead, Ghost bounded across the narrow bridge, Smalljan close behind. The others pounded after them, but Ghost came to a stop. John frowned, expecting Ghost to follow Smalljan. Instead, Ghost wheeled about and stood his ground at the bridge's edge, white fur bristling, lips curling in a silent snarl as the enemy bore down. John reached the bridge just as Ghost bolted past him, racing straight for the approaching Dothraki archer. The rider saw the direwolf too late. His horse whinnied and skidded, hooves slipping in panic, ruining the man's shot. The arrow loosed wildly, slicing past Ghost's flank. With a low, rumbling growl, Ghost leapt. The Dothraki barely had time to cry out before Ghost slammed into him, massive jaws clamping around his throat. The man toppled from the saddle as Ghost tore him down, hitting the earth hard. The rider's horse bolted in terror, crashing straight into the front ranks of the brave companions behind. The other horses shied away, stamping and snorting, unwilling to go near the monstrous direwolf now standing over the dead man's body. Jon pulled his horse to a stop at the far side of the bridge and gave a sharp whistle. Obediently, Ghost left his kill and sprinted to Jon's side, crimson staining his muzzle. The bloody mummers slowed, then reined in entirely. Whether they'd had enough of the chase or feared Ghost, Jon could not say, but they did not follow. They continued riding for another few miles before allowing their horses a rest, though they kept it short. Then they were off again, at a walk instead of a gallop, continuing southeast along the banks of the Blackwater, except now on the opposite bank. At night they set camp, guard duty split into shifts. A peaceful night followed, and they set out again early in the morning. Jon did not think it was possible for the world to be so green. He did not know of any other way to describe it. The Riverlands was a lot more vibrant than the muted north, but between its farmland it had muddy shores and rocky hills. In the northern reach there was just rolling hills of green and large swaths of crops stretching from the Gold Road down to the northern banks of the Mandaya. And it was not just the amount of crops, though in some areas it seemed to be never ending. It was the size and color of them, larger and richer than similar crops when grown in the harsh north. When it came to food, the reach was a place of abundance, that much Jon could see. With its vast fertile plains and plentiful harvest, it was no wonder the reach was the most powerful of the 7 kingdoms. They took what they needed from the fields as they went. They had avoiding doing so in the Riverlands, because the people had suffered enough, but they had no such qualms in the reach. They yanked cabbages, carrots, and onions from the ground, and stripped a few apple and pear trees from orchards they passed. It took them 10 days of riding through the northern reach before they finally reached the edge of the Kingswood. King's Landing lay just a few days east, not that Jon had any desire to go near the city. As they made camp along the forest's border, Ghost drifted toward the trees and came to a halt, staring into the dark beneath the branches. Jon noticed his direwolf's sudden stillness and moved to his side, hand resting near the hilt of his sword. Someone was there, but Ghost showed no sign of fear or aggression. Peering into the woods, Jon caught a glint of gold staring back at him, 2 golden eyes, steady and unblinking. His heart clenched as the shape behind them emerged, silver and smoky grey fur rippling as it padded silently from the shadows. Summer. Chapter 45, Stannis I and Jon 11. Stannis I. All the Stormlords who had sworn fealty to Renly mere moons ago now bent the knee to Stannis in the aftermath of the battle. One by one they came, grim-faced and weary, their banners lowered, offering oaths to him as they once offered to his brother. They were soon joined by 2 of the main houses of the Reach, House Meadows of Grassfield Keep and House Crane of Red Lake. Each brought their own sworn vassals in tow: Cobb, Woodbright, Blackbar, Varner, Hutchison, Dowell, and Willem. Then there were the knightly houses of the Reach who bent the knee, like both House Fossoes and House Risley of Risley Glade. These lords added their allegiance to that of House Florent of Brightwater Keep, Stannis' own kin by marriage. Yet for all their pledges and banners, they represented but a fraction of the Reach's true power. The truly great houses like Rowan of Golden Grove, Redwyne of the Arbor, Hightower of Old Town, and Tarly of Hornhill remained uncommitted, their swords and strength untouched by Stannis' cause, and their lords and heirs either dead on the field, or having fled the battle. And then there were the Tyrells. Stannis would think them quick to bend the knee, especially with Sir Loras now in his custody, tended by a maester on Stannis' own command. But word came that Sir Garland Tyrell had escaped the rout, fleeing the battlefield with several hundred cavalry at his back. No doubt he sped for Bitterbridge, where Renly's untouched infantry remained encamped, though what he would do when he reached that infantry remained to be seen. Would he march to free his brother, fall all the way back to Highgarden, or await his father's orders on how to proceed? Stannis had already dispatched his own riders to pursue Garland, to rally Renly's abandoned footmen, and to ride to the keeps and halls of the Eastern Reach, offering the great lords their chance to prove loyal to their rightful king or to reveal themselves as traitors deserving the same fate as those who had already fallen. With those plans in motion, he turned his attention to Storm's End, hoping to walk through the courtyard as he did when he was a boy, and to sleep in the Lord's chamber as he never had the chance to do growing up. Except Sir Courtenay Penrose, the Castellan placed in charge by Renly, would not yield Stannis' family ancestral seat to him. That was when the Red Priestess came to him, her thin silk gown hugging her body and drawing the eyes of almost every man around them. She had been weakened after the killing of Lords Tarly, Merryweather, and Rowan, and he had ordered her to stay in their camp lest her life be threatened. The child wolf flees north, she stated, unsettling red eyes gazing into his own. Where the white wolf searches for him. He knew that Lord Stark's young son had been a hostage in Renly's army, traveling with him from Highgarden to here at Storm's End. He had hoped that his men sent to his brother's camp would be able to find Brandon Stark, and bring him forth. Unlike his brother, he would not hold the boy hostage to assure the Starks were not a threat. He would have instead sent them a raven, that he would send their wayward son home as long as they did what they rightfully should have done from the start, swear him their allegiance. I have sent a few hundred men north to Bitterbridge, they will come upon him. Your men will ride on the King's Road before turning west along the Rose Road. The child wolf will stay ahead of your men for days, and when it comes that he will be overpassed, he will hide from your men's sight, deep in the Kingswood. I fear the child wolf is lost to you. He only grunted in response. He had written to House Stark, along with all the other great houses of the realm, when he had declared himself king, demanding their allegiance, and he had received not a single response from any of the northern houses. Even without the safe release of their kin, he would write to them again, as a reminder of their duty. Eddard Stark would have declared for him. No matter what Stannis might have thought of the man, he knew Eddard Stark would do the right thing. Perhaps it was fear for his father's life that stayed the Stark heirs declaring for the rightful king, perhaps not. He knew eventually he would have the North's loyalty, even if it had to wait until he marched upon King's Landing and personally freed Lord Stark from the claws of lions. And with the North would come the Riverlands. Their armies would be his, their victories would be his. My cousin, Lord Elwood Meadows, is the seneschal of the castle, Sir Edward Fossoe stated, one of the few of his new bannermen to make his voice heard in the war council he held the same night as the battle. His brothers have already pledged to you. If you remove Sir Courtenay, Elwood will surrender the castle to his king, I know it. Stannis felt Melisandre's eyes upon him at those words, burning a hole in the side of his head. If he so wished, she could have Sir Courtenay killed in the night, like Renly's top commanders had been killed the night before. We will give Sir Courtenay until the morning to come to his senses, Stannis said, voice firm as he avoided meeting Melisandre's eyes. The Red Priestess was useful in her own fashion with her visions and her whispers of fire and shadow, but Stannis misliked the way she carried herself, as if she were more than what she was. She spoke boldly, offering counsel as if it were command, forgetting that she stood not before some minor lordling or hedge knight, but the king of Westeros. Worse still, her influence had already crept into his own household, not only his wife but members of his wife's family, and even her personal guard, had taken to Orla's faith with fervor, hanging on the woman's every word. It irked him to see his court bending toward her flame, as if her god and not his justice would bring order to the realm. He ordered Sir Davos to set proper guard around their now expanded camp, and to make sure the prisoners were secured, especially the Tyrell boy. The man bowed and left to see it done. Stannis could see the looks on the faces of the highborn, their distaste at the influence one of Davos' birth had, and he inwardly scoffed. Davos had more than earned his position in Stannis' court by his actions and his counsel. None of these lords, especially those of the Reach and Stormlands who had first pledged themselves to Renly, had proven themselves as Davos had. He was awoken from his sleep at dawn, with word that the gates of Storm's End were open to them. After dressing himself, Stannis found Lord Meadows in front of the gates with a dozen men-at-arms. The man dropped to his knees in front of him, the men-at-arms following suit. Storm's End is yours, your grace, Lord Meadows said. Elwood Meadows had maybe seen 20 years, perhaps 21. He was slight of frame while his younger brothers, a few years younger, were both larger than him. What of Sir Courtenay? Stannis demanded. Fled in the night, your grace, Lord Meadows answered. With some loyal men and his ward, Edric Storm. Edric, Robert's only acknowledged bastard, had been conceived with Stannis' lady wife's cousin, on Stannis' own wedding night, in his own marriage bed. Because he had been born of a high-born woman and not a whore or a tavern wench, Robert had no choice but to confirm the child as his. The boy had been left at Storm's End as a ward to Sir Courtenay. No doubt the knight had come to care for the boy as he was as charismatic as his father, or so Stannis was told. Did Sir Courtenay truly believe Stannis would harm the boy, his own blood, his brother's son? To think him a kinslayer, when he had done everything in his power to avoid spilling Renly's blood. Had he not sent letters trying to remind Renly of his duty as the younger brother? Did he not send word to parley, so he could make Renly see sense? When he had kept the cavalry he commanded away from the reserve force, Renly commanded to make sure they never crossed swords. The accusation stung more than he cared to admit. They could not have escaped through any of the castle gates, he had men posted at each one through the night. That left the sea. A ship then, but not a large one. Anything sizable would have drawn the attention of the sailors blockading the keep, even at night. No, they would have fled aboard something small, hugging the jagged coastline at night to slip around his net unseen. In the treacherous waters of Shipbreaker Bay, under the cover of night, few possessed the skill to make such a crossing. But one of them served under his own command. He grounded his teeth at the thoughts in his head. Bring Sir Davos to me in the Solar, and gather the rest of the lords for a war council in the Great Hall. Though he called it a war council, Stannis had already made his decisions. The discussions were merely formality as he did not rule by committee. He would leave a modest garrison to hold Storm's End. Though Dragonstone had been his seat for nearly 17 years, Storm's End was the ancestral seat of his house and by right should have been his when Robert took the throne. Now, it would serve as the heart of his rule until the Iron Throne was rightfully beneath him. His prisoners would remain here under lock and key. There was no stronger castle in all of Westeros for withstanding a siege. Not all of the prisoners of course, for he had taken prisoner too many men after the battle and he did not have space to hold thousands of men. The highborns he would keep at Storm's End and the household and hedge knights who were captured would be sent to Dragonstone. The rest of them he would keep their arms, armor, and horse, and send them back to the Reach on foot. He would have his daughter brought here from Dragonstone, to know what it was like to grow up a child of House Baratheon as he once did. He had hoped Edric would still be here to offer his daughter companionship, as the two had gotten along in the past when in each other's company and it was hard for Shireen to make friends, but it seemed Sir Courtenay had other ideas. With Storm's End secured, his attention turned south. He would dispatch a force of several thousand to guard the Boneway, a narrow, ancient pass through the Red Mountains into Dorne. It had been the route of countless invasions. Though the Martells had made no moves, Stannis would not leave an opening for them or for one of their ambitious bannermen. The Marcher Lords of the Stormlands had battled the Dornish for generations. They would understand the strategic importance and necessity of the move, so a Marcher Lord would lead them. Lord Bryce Caron and Lord Aston Selmy had both pledged to Renly first, so Stannis did not have any trust in the men. Sir Donal Swan had also pledged to Renly first, though the man's father, Lord Gillan Swan, declared for no one, so Stannis trusted him even less. Lord Beric Dondarrion, though the youngest of them, had pledged to Stannis from the start. He would reward the Lightning Lord with the command. The rest of his men at Storm's End he would have march north, to King's Landing. He would have them meet with the infantry he had sent riders to pick up at Bitterbridge. He hoped the entire force of Renly's infantry, over 50,000 he was told, would be joining him. Yet he knew with many of their lords either refusing to bend the knee, or having no one still alive at Storm's End to bend the knee for the house, he would only get a portion of the footmen. Even a third of them would suit his needs. He would need to take King's Landing by force and quickly, before Tywin Lannister could turn his gaze from the wolves at his door. And while his army moved on land, his fleet would take to the sea. He would send it ahead to blockade Blackwater Bay, cutting off the capital from food, supplies, and escape. The Solar was different from how he remembered it. He had often sat in this room during the months of Lord Tyrell's siege of the castle, pondering if he was making the right choices. It looked vastly different now, with statues made of marble and tapestries woven from silk. No doubt they were Renly additions. He would have them removed. When Sir Davos was shown into the Solar, Stannis sat behind the heavy oaken desk that had once belonged to his father. The Onion Knight gave a respectful bow, stiff and formal as ever. "You summoned me, Your Grace," Davos said, his flea-bottom accent cutting through the quiet. Stannis studied him with his usual severity. Davos had never adopted the polished manners or lavish dress of the nobility, despite having held lands and title for over 16 years. But he was clean, steady, and carried himself with the quiet discipline of a man who had known a hard life. More tellingly, he showed no signs of guilt or fatigue, his posture straight. Sir Courtenay fled Storm's End last night, Stannis said flatly, his voice firm. He could not have escaped through the gates, for every one of them was watched. Davos stroked the stubble along his chin, his brow furrowing. By ship then. Though slipping through the blockade wouldn't be easy. A small vessel, hugging the coast, under the cover of night, Stannis replied, his gaze unwavering. Davos gave a short nod. A dangerous passage. Few could manage it. Indeed, Stannis said. And of those few, one stands before me now. Davos stiffened, eyes wide with disbelief. Your Grace, you can't truly think. I swear, I set the night's watch as ordered and took to my bed before the moon was high. I had no hand in this. I swear it, by the old gods and the new. Stannis watched him closely. Davos was many things, but a skilled liar he was not. His open, weathered face betrayed every thought and emotion he had. The man was telling the truth. I do not question your loyalty, Stannis said after a long pause. I suspected you, Sir Davos, not out of mistrust but out of admiration of your skills at sea. Know that you told me it was not you, and I take you at your word as I have always done. The tension that had overtaken Sir Davos' body bled away at those words. Thank you, Your Grace. Stannis did not acknowledge the thanks. Take some ships and sail along the coast to Griffin's Roost. Perhaps whoever sails for Sir Courtenay is not as skilled as we presume and has wrecked the ship on the shore. When the rest of the fleet sails north, they will do the same. Once done, turn and set sail for Blackwater Bay to join the blockade. You will be second in charge of the fleet to Sir Imry Florent. Jon 11. Jon let out a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding the moment he saw Summer alive and well. The sight of Bran's direwolf, who had gone so long without a name before Bran had settled on one while traveling to King's Landing with their father, brought a sense of relief. He had feared that both Summer and Sir Robar Royce had perished when Bran had been taken hostage by Renly Baratheon. But if the direwolf lived, perhaps the night did as well. The Kingswood stretched vast and ancient around them, its towering trees thick with moss. Their interlocking canopies let in little sunlight, bathing almost the entire forest in shadows. Though the southern woods were not the same as the Wolf's Wood, the deep quiet and the scent of damp earth brought back memories of old rides through the ancient forest of his home. Ahead of their horses moved Ghost and Summer. Ever since they had set out from the Golden Tooth, Jon had believed Ghost was leading them straight to Bran. But now it was clear his direwolf had been tracking Summer, and it was Summer who would lead him to his brother. They had been traveling the Kingswood for 5 days, staying off the 2 main roads that cut through it. They crossed the Rosa Road swiftly and kept to the edges of the King's Road, never far from it, but far enough to avoid detection. They passed through scattered woodland villages wary of strangers, but not hostile. The people here were loggers, foragers, hunters, and trappers, and though some gave fearful looks to the direwolves, they let the group pass unchallenged. Ghost and Summer always led the way, often several paces ahead of the riders. As they crept along a deer path that paralleled the King's Road, Jon felt Ghost grow tense. A moment later the fur of both direwolves bristled, and their ears twitched toward the sound of distant hoofbeats. Riders on the King's Road, Jon murmured to Kennett, who rode beside him. The lean youth gave a sharp nod and veered off to alert the others. The group pulled back, crouching low in the saddle and guiding their mounts into the brush for cover. A few hundred knights and men-at-arms thundered past on destriers and coursers, armor glinting, banners flapping. While the crowned stag of House Baratheon led the procession, Jon studied the sigils that followed with careful eyes. From the reach he recognized the red fox of House Florent, the twin apples of both Fossoway branches, the golden cranes of House Crane, and the flowered border of House Meadows. From the Stormlands rode the buckles of House Buckler, the crow of House Morrigan, the nightingales of House Caron, the maelstrom of House Wild, and the spruce trees and crescent moon of House Fell. Where are they headed? Brian whispered. Jon didn't answer his squire because he had no answer to give. That many men wouldn't be enough to lay siege to a city, nor did they carry the look of an army on the march. Could Renly already be moving on King's Landing, and these men were reinforcements coming from a distant posting? He glanced at Summer, now lying calmly beside Ghost. The direwolf had led them south, not toward the capital, but toward Storm's End. Renly's army might be at King's Landing, but Bran was being held at the seat of House Baratheon. They resumed their southward journey after the riders passed. Summer began to act more animated, bounding ahead, pausing to look back with impatience. Ghost followed at a more measured pace. By the 6th day, they reached the banks of a river Jon guessed to be the Wendwater. The stone bridge that spanned it was part of the King's Road, and they debated whether to cross openly or seek a ford deeper into the forest. They had little time to decide. Summer suddenly bolted. Jon's head snapped toward the direwolf, who raced toward the bridge with ears perked and tail high. Ghost stayed behind, tense but not agitated. A small group of riders, 6 by Jon's count, had just begun crossing the bridge. Summer! The joyous cry startled the horses, and Jon froze. He knew that voice. Spurring his mount, he galloped through the trees until the bridge came fully into view. A small brown palfrey stood on trembling legs while Summer danced in excitement around its hooves. Atop the saddle sat Bran, laughing, trying to calm both horse and wolf. "Bran," Jon whispered, disbelieving. Among the riders he spotted Sir Robar Royce, unarmored but unmistakable. The others he didn't know, but 2 boar crests he recognized, Hightower and Tarth. Knights loyal to Renly. It made no sense. Why would Bran be here, far from Storm's End, with such a small escort? But Summer showed no sign of distress, and neither did Ghost. Jon trusted the instincts of the direwolves more than any words. He dismounted quickly, running the last few paces. "Bran!" His brother turned, mouth falling open in astonishment. "Jon!" Jon reached up and pulled Bran down from the saddle, hugging him tightly. Bran clung to him, burying his face in Jon's shoulder. "You found me." "Of course I did," Jon murmured. He pulled away from his brother to take a look at him. He ignored the trail of tears down his cheeks and gave him a once-over. He was taller than when they last saw each other, and the plumpness of youth was melting away. It was hard to believe his brother was already 10 years old. He did not see any signs of injury or malnourishment and thanked the gods for that. Out of the woods came the rest of his riders, led by Smalljon. They eyed the 4 unknown knights warily, hands resting upon the hilts of their weapons, ready to draw them at moment's notice. "Sirs Humphrey, Reynard, and Adam are friends, as well as Lady Brienne," Sir Robar said, placing himself between the 2 parties. Jon did a double take at the largest of the knights, only to realize they were in fact a lady. She had long, shoulder-length brittle straw-colored hair and broad, coarse face covered in freckles. She looked smaller than Smalljon, but it was not by much. "I would hear your story," Brother Jon said, eyeing those Sir Robar claimed were friends, "but I think it better we move away from the King's Road." With Bran and his escort in tow, Jon turned his company back the way they had come. Although they would still ride within it for several days more, he would be glad to leave the Kingswood behind. As they rode, Bran, with the occasional help from Sir Robar, told him about what had happened to them since father had been arrested for treason. Their ride from Old Town, Renly offering his protection and then finding out what that protection meant. Jon noted the hard glances cast toward the Knights of the Reach, who had the decency to look ashamed, and even toward Lady Brienne, though she kept her silence and wore her regret plain on her face. Smalljon let out a low growl, his hand reaching over his shoulder to grip the worn pommel of his great sword. The gesture was not subtle, and the Reachmen shifted nervously in their saddles. Renly's death, when it was recounted, left the Northmen and Rivermen in shock. Only weeks before, Renly Baratheon had stood on what many thought was the surest path to the Iron Throne. He had the wealth and the numbers on his side, but had been outmaneuvered by his older brother, who had been severely lacking in both. "The men we saw yesterday must have ridden for Stannis," said Brian Free, looking to Jon for approval at his observation. "Likely to Bitterbridge," Sir Humphrey replied with a slow nod, "to gather what remains of King Renly's infantry, at least those who will bend the knee." The men of the Reach, though loyal to their lords, had no illusions about how fickle allegiances had become. Some of them would now ride for Stannis if their lords commanded it, Jon knew. The Knights of the Reach before him did not know to whom their lord relatives pledged to anymore. Lady Brienne assumed her father had, or would, bend the knee to Stannis, as the rest of the Stormlords had, but the Reach was a different story. In return for their tales, Jon shared what had passed since he left Winterfell, crossing the Twins, the Battle of Whispering Woods, the Battle of the Camps, and the taking of the Golden Tooth. He told of their skirmish with the brave companions in the southern Riverlands, and of the burnt-out villages they had come across. None of the knights who had come with Bran had ever seen a battle. They listened with wide eyes and growing unease as Jon described their skirmishes and close calls. Only Brienne remained silent and steady. She had fought at Renly's side during his clash with Stannis, and Bran pointed out that though it was dirty and ripped, she still wore her Rainbow Guard cloak with honor. Brian the Blue, Bran had said proudly, causing the lady to blush at his praise. Jon did not imagine Brian was used to kind words. He was glad she had become friends with his brother because Bran was the nicest person Jon knew and had plenty of kind words to give to any he called friend. When Bran is safely at Riverrun, I mean to join the fight, Sir Robar said, the eager gleam in his eyes catching the firelight as they made camp one night. I would not sit idle while Westeros burns. The other knights nodded their agreement, young and filled with purpose. Summer Knights, Jon thought grimly. He didn't say it aloud. They were each older than him, Sir Humphrey and Sir Robar by a few years, Sir Rhaenyra by several, and Sir Adam by more than a decade, but Jon knew they would learn what war truly was and then none of them would wish for it. To avoid another run-in with the brave companions, the company opted to take a longer route back into the Riverlands, steering well away from the Gold Road and crossing the Blackwater Rush farther upstream near Stony September. From the Golden Tooth to Bran's trail had taken nearly 3 weeks, and Jon imagined it would take the same to reach Riverrun. They passed burned villages, small folk huddled in ruined barns, and smoke rising far off on the horizon. The scars of war cut deep into the land. Even the northern reach was not spared from the ravages, as farms filled with field hands on their journey south, were now burnt-out ruins with rotting crops. On the 14th day of their return march, still several miles south of Stony September, as the sun dipped low behind a ridge of hills, Ghost and Summer halted suddenly at the edge of a steep hill. Summer let out a low growl, and while Ghost did not make a noise his bared teeth showed his aggravation. Jon strained his ears and heard the faint sound of screams and metal clanging together. He dismounted quickly and crawled forward beside the direwolves. Below in a torn-up meadow, 2 hosts clashed like hammers on steel. He recognized the Black Ravens of House Blackwood, pressed hard against brutal opposition. The Lannister banners were not flying, but the 3 dogs of House Clegane flapped proudly in the wind. Sir Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, looked like a war god among them, hacking through armored men as though they were bundles of straw. Jon's breath caught. They had stumbled into a battle in full swing. They should go around it. The goal had been to rescue Bran and bring him to safety. This was not their fight. He turned, to see that some of the others had joined him. Back to the horses, he commanded. Jon climbed back into the saddle, and led them along the ridge of the hill. He kept one eye on the battle below them and another in front of them, to make sure the fighting did not spill into their path. Somehow, the mountain had been knocked from his horse and now fought on foot, his massive frame still towering above the melee. Lord Tytos Blackwood pressed the advantage, lashing out from the saddle with his blade. The steel bounced off the mountain's plate, barely leaving a scratch. With a single sweeping blow from the massive greatsword he wielded in one hand, Sir Gregor Clegane struck Blackwood's horse in the neck. The beast shrieked and buckled, and the lord tumbled to the earth in a tangle of limbs and steel. Before Lord Blackwood could regain his footing, the mountain's next blow separated his head from his shoulders in one brutal stroke. Gasps of dismay rang out from the 3 Blackwood men-at-arms who had been assigned to Jon's party 10 nights ago. One of them muttered a curse, the other made the sign of the 7, and all 3 looked as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath them. Lordless, the Blackwood lines began to falter, despite still holding an advantage in numbers. Morale had been shattered, and Jon knew what came next, a rout. Jon wheeled his horse toward Bran. Circle the fight and continue to follow the river north. Stony September should be 2, maybe 3 miles ahead. Summer will know the way. Bran looked like he wanted to protest, but Jon cut him off with a glance. Gannon, he called, pointing to the burly Stark guardsman who carried a warhammer across his back. Get my brother out of here. See to it he comes to no harm. I am Lord Gannon grunted, spurring his mount alongside Bran's. Smalljan grunted in approval and reached for the weapon strapped to his waist. Though he preferred a great sword when on foot, on horseback he favored a heavy flanged mace the size of Jon's head. The others followed suit, drawing steel in silence. There was no time for any of them to retrieve their helms from their saddlebags. Jon unsheathed his sword and held it high. For the Starks. For the Tullys. He didn't wait to see who followed. His horse surged beneath him, and though he didn't join them in rushing the battlefield, Summer let out a long, bone-chilling howl that echoed across the hills. Down below, heads turned. Steel clashed. The battle shifted. Jon crashed into the melee, cutting down the first two Clegane men with brutal efficiency. He barely registered them, his eyes locked on the mountain. The man appeared to be in a bloodlust, swinging wildly at all who got within his reach, even his own men. The rest of the battlefield had given the monster a wide berth. Jon did not. He rode right at him, keeping his horse steady. He spurred his horse harder, lowering his blade. At the last moment, his mount sensed the coming impact and tried to veer off. Jon yanked hard on the reins, keeping it on course. They smashed into Gregor Clegane at full tilt. It felt like colliding with a stone wall. The force of the impact sent both horse and rider flying. Jon's feet came loose from the stirrups in time, and as they crashed to the ground, he managed to roll clear of his thrashing mount. Something in his foot snapped, but adrenaline muted the pain. His horse screamed, panicked and flailing, and Jon dragged himself free before it could crush him. Winded and stunned, Jon looked up to see the mountain dragging himself to his feet. It was hard to see what damages or pain the man suffered beneath his helm and armor, his massive great sword still clenched in one hand. Jon staggered upright a well, but his sword was gone. His eyes darted to the dirt around him. No sign of it. But as the gods would have it, there was fallen mace, dented and blooded. He hobbled toward it, nearly stumbling as he bent to pick it up. The haft was thick, the head heavy. It was meant for one hand, but he gripped it with both. The mountain raised his sword. Jon moved in. The blade, almost as tall as Jon, swung through the air, but the movement was sluggish, slow enough for Jon to duck beneath it. He swung the mace into the giant's knee with all the strength he could muster. Armor crunched and something cracked. The mountain roared. He crumpled to one knee. The mountain tried to swing at him again, but Jon kicked out at his wrist, catching the gauntlet and halting the wild swing of that massive sword. Then, standing over him, Jon lifted the mace and brought it crashing down against the helm. Steel groaned as the helm caved in. Gregor let out a monstrous scream, and for a breathless second, Jon feared even that was not enough to stop him. But then the mountain pitched forward with a crash that shook the earth, and lay still. Jon stood over the fallen giant, breath heaving, heart thundering in his ears. And then a sharp, searing agony exploded across the side of his face. There was screaming then, but none of it was him. Others screamed in agony and panic. Amongst all of it he heard his name being called. He stumbled backward. He reached up to touch at his cheek, which felt on fire. He pulled his hand back and saw blood on his gauntlet. His blood. Oh, he muttered numbly, the world tilting. Then the darkness took him, and he fell. Chapter 46, Rob 12. Rob 12. Sitting alone beneath the red leaves of Riverrun's heart tree, a thin weirwood with a sad face, Rob stared blankly at the letter he had held on his person since first receiving it from Sir Desmond all those days ago. The parchment, wrinkled though it was, trembled slightly in his hands, though whether from the soft wind or his own fingers, he couldn't say. He read the words again and again, but they never changed. Written in Maester Lewin's small, careful script, the letter had brought him tidings from Winterfell. Lady Winifred has given birth to a healthy boy. She named him Cregan. Both mother and baby are well. Joyous news, yet other words felt like a blade through his chest. Lady Catelyn has succumbed to her wounds. With the arrival of one raven, Robb Stark had learned he was a father and had lost his mother in the same breath. A son born into the world as his grandmother departed it, blood and life exchanged, as if the gods themselves demanded a price. He supposed he should feel something like gratitude that the rest of his family had escaped the assassins sent after them unharmed, and that Sansa had returned safely to Winterfell. But grief clouded everything else. His heart refused to stir for joy. It ached too bitterly for the mother he would never speak to again. He sat beneath the weirwood tree for the whole of the morning, the carved face above him weeping its crimson sap as though mourning alongside him. Rob thought he understood that ancient sorrow now. That first day, when he had opened the letter while breaking his fast, after holding off on doing so the night before, if Theon hadn't come looking for him, perhaps he would have sat in the godswood until the moon was high. Theon said nothing at first. He simply settled beside him, hands clasped between his knees, as if unsure of his place in the quiet depths of Rob's grief. "I'm sorry," Theon said eventually, his voice low, uncharacteristically soft. "Lady Catelyn was a good woman. She deserved better than this." Rob did not look at him. He knew well enough his mother had regarded Theon with suspicion, though she had treated him with more courtesy than she had ever shown Jon. Still, she had kept Theon at arm's length, unwilling to forget the boy's name or the father he bore it from. Whatever Theon truly thought, he kept it hidden from Rob, instead offering him kind words and comfort. "Thank you," Rob rasped. His voice sounded raw to his own ears. For a while, they sat in silence, broken only by the rustle of the godswood leaves. Then Theon spoke again. "Is there any hint who sent them?" Rob's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened where they gripped the letter. "Who else but the Lannisters? Who else would wish my family dead?" His throat burned as he forced the words out. "If it wasn't for the direwolves." He couldn't finish the thought. But he had thought of it. Gods, how he'd thought of it. Rickon dead. Arya dead. Winifred dead, bled out beside her murdered child. His son strangled or butchered before he even opened his eyes for the first time. The image made his stomach twist, made his hand itch for his sword. If he could, he would ride this very day, cut a bloody path through Harrenhal and then King's Landing itself until no Lannister remained breathing. But that was not how wars were won. "How would father react to this, I wonder?" Rob said, voice distant. "His lady wife murdered under the orders of the same family who keep him in chains." He thought of his father alone in some cold cell, waiting to reunite with a love that he would only see again in the next life, and the ache in his chest deepened. Beside him, Theon shifted. Rob could sense his hesitation, could almost hear the words gathering behind his teeth before he spoke. "What of the Kingslayer?" Theon said at last, cautious, like a man testing thin ice. "If you want revenge." He didn't need to finish. His eyes said the rest. Yes. Jaime Lannister was still their prisoner, kept in his secluded room. Rob could inflict whatever torment he desired upon the Kingslayer, could answer blood with blood if it would ease his grief. He had thought of it more than once. And not just the Kingslayer, for Willem Lannister and Shenfrey, both mere squires a few years younger than himself, also sat as this prisoner. Yet he knew what would follow. If any Lannister bled at his hands and word got out, Eddard Stark would bleed in turn. The Lannisters would make certain of that. So Rob said nothing. He only stared down at the letter, at the words written in Lewin's steady hand. "I cannot trade one life for another like that," Rob said quietly, though whether to Theon or himself he wasn't sure. Not even hers. It was over 2 Senites later that ill tidings arrived in the form of riders from Harrenhal. The noose Robb Stark had hoped to tighten around Tywin Lannister's neck had slipped loose 2 days before it was meant to pull taut. 5 days passed, as the sun crested the horizon. Lord Tywin had marched the entirety of his host south out of Harrenhal, moving with a speed none had expected, right into the path of Lords Piper and Shawnee's 10,000 men. The battle had been a bloody, frantic thing. Piper and Shawnee barely had time to form their lines before the Lannisters were upon them. Scouts watching Harrenhal had spied the movement and ridden hard to warn the other 2 Riverland hosts nearby, else the battle would have been far worse. Robert Glover had led the northern vanguard in a frantic rush from their camp a few miles north of Harrenhal the moment the word reached him, not waiting for orders from Lord Bolton. Likewise, Uncle Brynden had taken the best of Uncle Edmure's cavalry and gave chase without hesitation. Both men moved with the urgency of those who understood just how costly delay could be. An hour into the fighting, Uncle Brynden's 1,000-strong cavalry smashed into the Lannister reserve, catching none other than Tywin Lannister himself at their head. Almost at the same moment, 2,000 Northmen came barreling down on the Lannister left flank from the rear, roaring like wolves. Though Tywin's numbers remained greater, the terrain and the surprise left him vulnerable. Being pressed on three sides with no clear sense of how far behind the rest of the Riverlords and Northmen marched, Tywin had made a choice. He ordered a retreat east, fleeing the Riverlands entirely and slipping into the Crown lands. When the dust settled, the Riverlords and their northern allies counted their losses. 800 dead, twice that wounded. The Lannisters had been blooded, but their casualties were perhaps half what the defenders had suffered. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Robb had thought he might soon have his revenge for his mother's murder. Ned Stark, he knew, was not worth the price of both Jaime and Tywin Lannister. He'd give King Joffrey back his uncle, father, but Tywin Lannister would have met justice. However, the gods had other plans. The Kingslayer remained locked away, Tywin had escaped, and Robb was left with vengeance unfilled while the war dragged on. The remains of Lords Piper and Shawnee's host combined with Uncle Ed Muir's. The Riverlands host marched west to again set up camp outside of Raventree Hall. Roose Bolton and the northern host, including the Mountain clans and the Karstark men who had ridden with Uncle Ed Muir, had taken Harrenhal without contest. With Tywin fled, there had been no siege and no storming of the towering walls. The food stores that had been left behind had mostly been either burned or purposefully soiled. The stables had been burned as well. Unfortunately, Lady Went did not survive Lannister occupation, and she had been preceded in death by not only her husband, but all of her children. If Robb was not mistaken, he was the next in line for Harrenhal through his maternal grandmother, who was a Went. She was the cousin of Lord Walter Went, who hosted the infamous tourney at Harrenhal, and his brother Sir Oswell Went, a Kingsguard for the Mad King. The two armies would await orders for their next moves. All save for a few. Uncle Ed Muir, Lord Harry on Karstark, and Sirs Willis and Wyman Marndaly had broken off from the greater hosts, each riding to Riverrun with their own escorts of varying size. For what purpose, the rider who brought the news did not know, only that they would arrive within the next few days. Robb felt as though he had already been cloistered within Riverrun's walls for too long. It had been over 2 se'nights now, which was one too many. He should have been in the field with his men, riding alongside them beneath the Stark banners, not pacing like a caged wolf within stone halls. He had delayed, telling his battle guard he was waiting for the siege on Harrenhal to spring shut at last. Though he would not lie to himself and say that his grief had nothing to do with his delay. As for Harrenhal, he had thought himself clever, patient and methodical in his plans, similar to how people viewed the Lord of Casterly Rock. But Tywin Lannister had outmaneuvered him. So he resigned himself to staying at Riverrun for another se'night, at least until he knew why Uncle Ed Muir, Harrenhal, and the Manderly brothers were heading to the castle. It would give him time to think of new potential plans. In Harrenhal sat roughly 15,000 Northmen, and soon camps outside Raventree Hall would have roughly the same amount of Rivermen. If he brought back the men raiding the Westerlands, that would give him another 7,500 men. That amount combined was more than enough to storm King's Landing, but he would need to deal with Tywin Lannister before that could happen. A few days later and Robb learned the reason behind the expected arrival of his uncle and the 3 northern nobles with the arrival of the banners of House Free that appeared on the horizon. The column was sizable, about 100 strong, led by Lord Stephen Free himself. Riding at his side were his son Walton, his grandson Edwin, and his younger brother Sir Benfrey, each bearing the blue and grey of the twins. Behind them rolled a large, ornate wheelhouse, its wooden panels painted with the twin towers of House Free and trimmed in silver. When it finally came to a halt in Riverrun's outer yard, the doors creaked open and 5 young women emerged, each one clad in fine wool. Robb recognized none of them at first, though it did not take long for names to be forthcoming. They were Fairwalder, Alex, Roslyn, Aerwin, and Tita, daughters and granddaughters of the deceased Lord Walder. Robb recalled that during his brief time at the Twins, beauty had been scarce among the Free daughters, a common jest in the camps afterward. But it seemed whatever beauty the Freys did possess had been gathered and sent south in this wheelhouse. Roslyn in particular was striking with chestnut hair, soft eyes, and the quiet demeanor of someone unaccustomed to attention. A wedding Lord Stephen had said with a knowing smile as Robb and Sir Desmond Grell strode out to greet him at the gate. In what I believe was his first act as Lord of Carhold, young Lord Harrenhal wrote to me, requesting the hand of my sister Roslyn in marriage. Robb blinked at the revelation. He had known Harry on Karstark was taken with Roslin, what with the way his foster brother had spoken of her during the long ride from the twins, but to send a proposal so soon. Lord Rackard had been sentenced to the Night's Watch a little over 2 nights ago, and a raven had been sent to Raventree Hall to pass the message along to Harryon. Lord Stephen must have been right in that Harryon's first order as the official Lord of Carhold had been to ask for Roslin's hand in marriage. How much time had they truly spent together back at the twins? They had been at the twins for a little over a day, and likely the two had spent maybe a few hours in each other's company. It seemed hardly enough to kindle such conviction. Then again, Rob mused, Harryon had always been the romantic sort beneath his grim northern reserve. And Sir Wendell has asked for the hand of my other sister, tighter Lord Stephen added, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. That at least made more sense. Rob had instructed Sir Wendell Marndaly, upon granting him the White Tower as his seat, to find a wife and begin a family. The line of that ancient holdfast needed to continue so as not to fall abandoned again. Sir Wendell had lingered at the twins for several weeks while waiting upon Lord Karstark's forces, and it seemed he had used the time to court the affable and plump Tita Free, called Tita the maid amongst her kin because she had seen 30 years and had not, at least as far as anyone was aware, laid with a man. As the Castellan and Master-at-Arms of Riverrun, Sir Desmond welcomed the Freys into the keep and ordered rooms to be set up for them. The two Freys in Rob's battle guard, Sir Pewin and his squire Oliver, approached their full sister to congratulate her on her upcoming wedding, and to greet their elder brother Sir Benfrey, who also came from the same mother. There would be little delay once Harryon and Sir Wendell arrived. The weddings would take place right after each other, one in the September and the other in the Godswood, and then a combined feast to celebrate the new couples. The Freys had brought with them wagons loaded with food for the celebration, as well as servants to help prepare it all. Sir Desmond, now aware of the wedding the castle would be hosting in a few days' time, set the servants of House Tully to the task of preparing the keep. Lady Roslin, if I may have a moment, he asked after the initial courtesies had been exchanged. Of course, my lord, she replied, her voice soft but steady. He offered his arm and she placed her hand upon it with practiced grace. Together they walked through the stone corridors of Riverrun, heading toward the Godswood where she would be wed to his foster brother in a matter of days. The air grew cooler beneath the shade of the trees enclosed by high, moss-covered walls. I have never seen a Godswood before, Roslin murmured as they stepped beneath the leafy canopy. Carhold is half the size of Riverrun, Rob told her, but its Godswood is twice as large. The Weirwood there is 10 times the size of this one, older than the castle itself. Its branches stretch wide enough to cast shade across the entire grove. She gazed at Riverrun's modest heart tree, her imagination no doubt trying to summon the image of one so vast. I do not know your devotion to the Seven, but there are few septs in the north, Rob warned. The Marndalis have their snowy September in White Harbour, and there are others nearby the city that their small folk worship at, but the closest to Carhold would be the one at Winterfell. It was built by my father for my mother and meant to hold only a handful of believers. I will take my husband's gods, Roslin answered, looking at him with determined eyes. I have no relation with the Seven. It is hard for one to be devout in the twins. Rob arched a brow. Too crowded. Too divided, she answered. Too many voices raised in petty prayer, hoping for advantage over their own blood. Rob nodded slowly, imagining what it must have been like growing up in a castle where there were more siblings than most had cousins. 100 relatives vying for Lord Walder's approval, each hoping another might fall out of favor or into ruin, all so they could move up in the convoluted line of succession. Your kin, the wives and children of those who Lord Stephen sent to the wall, what has become of them? Roslin exhaled a quiet sigh, as though she'd been expecting the question. The cleverest of my nephews were sent to the citadel to become maesters. The rest were sent to septs to begin training as septons. My good sisters were offered back to their families. Some were welcomed, others not. Those who were turned away have taken the vows of the Silent Sisters. And your nieces, he asked, already dreading the answer. The ones deemed unmarriageable are being sent to the faith to become septars. The others. She hesitated, her voice tightening. My brother is marrying them off to any man who asks, be they hedge knight or tavern owner. So long as it rids him of a burden. Rob grimaced at her words. The Freys, reduced though they were in numbers, still had prestigious positions in his army. Stefan was Castellan of the Golden Tooth, Blackwalder led a force raiding the Westerlands, Sir Ryman protected the Western River road pass through the mountains, Sir Pewin was part of his battle guard, Oliver was his squire, and Brian was John's. Yet even more suffered because of his actions. He had taken up cause with Stephen Free, also Rob could cross the twins. He had done so not fully comprehending the consequences of his action. He should apologize for his hand in the life he had condemned dozens of Freys to, though he doubted any besides Lord Stephen and his closest kin were aware of the full story. Instead, he changed the subject. Harry-on has talked much about you. You have made quite the impression on him. Roslyn blushed at his words, her gaze turning to the ground as she wrung her hands. Lord Harry-on was very sweet to me when your army was crossing the twins. I had hoped my brother could arrange a marriage between us, but Lord Ricard declined, and then, well. If it brought you and Harry-on together, then I'm glad at least some good came from my judgment of Lord Ricard. 3 days later, as a morning fog blanketed the ground, trumpets rang from Riverrun's ramparts. Rob stood in the upper courtyard with Sir Desmond Grell and a pair of household guards, watching the procession wind its way over the bridge. Banners of houses Tully, Carstark, and Marndale flapped lazily in the summer breeze. At the head rode Lord Edmure Tully, his jaw tight and eyes dark, beside Harry-on Carstark, who looked drawn and paler than Rob remembered. Behind them, Willis and Wendell Marndale rode abreast, the older brother Sommer, the younger offering a wide, as he spotted Rob waiting at the gate. And behind them were two unexpected companions, Robert Glover, leaner and more weathered than the last time Rob had seen him, and at his side, the towering bulk of Arlo Val, heir to Hugo Val. Rob waited for them to dismount from their horses before stepping forward to greet them personally. "Uncle," he said, grasping Edmure's forearm. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon, but I understand there is a reason." "We failed," he said with no preamble. "Harrenhal is ours, but Tywin's host slipped away before we could trap him." Harry-on Carstark gave a grim nod. "I was with the Blackfish when we attacked the Lannister reserve. I could see the old lion, but I couldn't get to him. It was a good thing our vanguard got there when it did," added Robert Glover. Lord Bolton was slow to react to the news of the Lannisters fleeing. Rob absorbed the words in silence, already forming new battle plans in his head. Then he turned to Edmure and placed a hand on his uncle's shoulder. "There's something else," Rob said, his voice lowering. "We received a raven from Winterfell 6 days ago." Edmure looked up sharply. "What happened?" Rob's jaw tensed. "Mother is dead. She was killed by an assassin." The color drained from Edmure's face. "What?" "Men slipped into the castle and made to kill my family during the Hour of the Wolf. They failed to kill Arya, Rickon, and Winifred, but my lady mother was not so lucky. Maester Lewin says she was stabbed with a poisoned blade in the stomach, and despite his best efforts, she succumbed to the wound." Silence fell between them, the clamor of arriving horses and shouted commands fading into background noise. Edmure sat down heavily on the ground, burying his face in his hands. "Not Cat." The words were muffled by his hands, just like the cries that followed. "I'm sorry," Rob said, putting a comforting hand on his uncle's shoulder. "I would have told you sooner, but I couldn't find the strength to put it in a letter." Edmure said nothing, only gave a small nod and wiped at his eyes. Rob had already spent the past several days grieving, so he let his uncle do the same, turning instead to greet the rest of the party. Willis and Wendell bowed courteously, while Arlo Val gave Rob a curt nod. Each of them expressed their condolences. Robert Glover, a gruff and blunt man, simply said, "We'll need to strike again soon. The Lannisters won't keep running." The weddings were held that evening. The first in the castle's September, Sir Wendell Marndale wed Tyta Free before a small crowd of Riverlords and Northern Bannermen. The chamber echoed with polite applause as the bride blushed and Wendell smiled as if he'd won a golden prize. Rob offered a nod when Sir Willis caught his eye, but it was hollow courtesy. The second was beneath the branches of Riverrun's small godswood, where Harry-on Carstark took Roslyn Frey's hand before the heart tree. Rob stood in attendance, but his mind was elsewhere. He barely heard the words spoken by Robert Glover, who presided over the ceremony. He had expected weddings to be moments of joy, brief respites from the bloodshed. Instead, they passed like scenes in a dream, formal and fleeting. His bannermen drank and laughed at the feast that followed, but Rob felt the weight of grief in his chest, and a gnawing sense that more blood was yet to come. During the feast, amidst the clamour of cups, Rob's eyes were drawn to quiet movements at the long tables. At one end, he noticed hushed conversations between Robert Glover, Sir Willis Marndaley, and the northern members of his battle guard, Torrhen Stark, Morgan Liddell, Roderick Forrester, Dacy Mormont, Hoarfrost Umber, and Owen Norrie. There were no raised voices or overt signs of tension, but the way they leaned in close, sharing murmured words with furrowed brows and narrowed eyes, suggested the talk was not idle. Rob tried not to let his gaze linger too long. The words exchanged were beyond his hearing, but not his suspicion. Whatever it was they discussed, he sensed it had little to do with weddings or toasts. He felt like he received his answer after dawn the next day, when the horns atop Riverrun's towers rang out for the second time in 2 days. Rob, who had been standing atop an inner wall with Theon, going over the start of plans of a siege of King's Landing, watched as the gates opened to the thunder of hooves and the rattle of wagons. Great Jon Umber and Mage Mormont led a column of 200 Northmen. Yet it was not only warriors they brought. Herds of cattle snorted as they were corralled through the gates, followed by bleating goats, pigs in wooden carts, braying donkeys, and horses thick with muscle. Wagon after wagon rolled behind, each loaded high with goods, chickens in cages, barrels of dried fruit and salt fish, sacks of barley and oats, baskets of turnips, and crates of apples, pears, and plums. One cart was draped in cloth of gold, its contents hidden but clearly valuable. And there, in the middle, was a cart full of people. "We left Helman Tallheart and Robin Flint in command," Great Jon called out unprompted, noticing Rob watching from the wall. "We've plundered enough food and supplies to feed 2 armies. Was wasting too much steel guarding spoils when we could bring it here." Rob gave a nod of approval, though he knew there was more to it. He had left the Great Jon and Mage not even 2 moons ago, and it must have taken them a moon's turn to march their column to Riverrun. This was 3 to 4 se'nights worth of raiding the Westerlands. "Who are our guests?" Rob shouted down, noticing the silk clothes and tied hands. "Lady Westerling and her children," Mage answered. "We stormed the crag, only lost a few men." "Don't we have Lord Westerling?" Theon asked, raising an eyebrow at Rob. "At Seaguard," Rob answered, "under care of the Mallisters." "Ahem, excuse me, Lord Rob." Rob and Theon turned to see Maester Vimen standing, his hands out in front of him. Within his fingers he grasped a folded piece of parchment. "This just arrived." Maester Vimen held out the letter. With a frown, Rob eyed the wax seal. The wax was black, and though Rob did not know every sigil in the Riverlands, he knew it was a Riverland house because the seal had a fish on it. "Where did the raven come from?" Rob asked as he accepted the parchment. "The Stony September. Lord Shawnee was near Raventree Hall." If Rob remembered correctly, his brother, Sir Wilbert, was in charge of the town and its people. Was it he who wrote a letter for Rob? He broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. As he read, he could not stop his jaw from dropping as he read. "What is it?" Theon asked, trying to look over his shoulder. Jon toppled a mountain. Chapter 47, Arya 4 and Bran 6. Arya 4. The direwolves were howling again, as they had every night for the past 2 se'nights. Their cries rose and fell through the chill night air, a mournful chorus that set the hairs on Arya's arms on edge. Old Nan had said they were merely reflecting the grief of their masters. Even Maester Lewin, who once scoffed at many of the old woman's tales, had no response to her words. Despite Lewin's best efforts to fight the poison, Arya's mother had lingered only 2 days after the assassin's blade had plunged into her body. She was gone now, and Winterfell felt emptier than Arya had ever imagined it could. She had stopped going to her lessons. Neither Maester Lewin nor Septa Mordane made any effort to convince her otherwise. They had struggled to do so under better circumstances, and both must have known it would be a futile effort while she was swallowed by her grief. Even Sirio's water dancing lessons she had abandoned, though Needle rested by her bed like a silent accusation. Instead, she drifted. Today, her feet had carried her to the September. She had never cared much for the gods of her mother. She never cared much for religion in general, but growing up she had shown more interest in the gods of her father, the gods of tree and stone. However, no matter how many times she sat in front of the weirwood, They had given her nothing but silence over the past several days. In the September were her mother's gods. Perhaps they would answer where the old gods would not. Perhaps they could tell her why. Why did it have to be her mother? The door creaked open behind her. Arya did not turn. Septon Chale and Septum Ordain passed through often enough. They had tried to talk to her those first few days, to offer their condolences and support, but she hadn't acknowledged their presence, let alone listened to anything they had to say. But the voice that came was not theirs. "Is this where you have been, child, instead of your lessons and your meals?" Syrio Forel's accent rolled through the air, soft yet insistent. Arya kept her gaze fixed on the carved likeness of the mother, lips pressed tight. She would not cry in front of him. "When you look upon your home, what do you see?" Syrio asked. She chewed on her lip. She wanted to be alone in her suffering. Why couldn't Syrio see that? "What do you see?" he insisted. "I see Winterfell," Arya snapped, anger rising up in her chest. What a stupid question to ask. What did he expect her to say? "Wrong. You do not see," Syrio said, stepping closer, his voice carrying a hint of disappointment. "Not as I have taught you to see. You think only of your sorrow, but you are not alone in it." She turned then, eyes narrowed and first clenched. His dark eyes held hers without wavering. "Your good sister tries to stand in Lady Catelyn's place," Syrio continued, "but she is a new mother, and to those who live here, she is not a Stark. Not yet. And the household, they do not trust her enough. Instead the servants look to your sister for guidance, yet she is drowning, just as you are. And the little lord, his grief is loud. Too loud. It consumes him. His wolf feels it also, and grows fierce and untamed. The servants and guard fear him now, fear both boy and beast. The man Lewin tries his best, but he is old and he cannot control the little lord." Arya's stomach tightened. She had noticed it too. Rickon's sharp outbursts and his tear-streaked cheeks. Shagidog snapping at servants and tearing apart whatever he could sink his teeth into. It was worse than it had been a few moons ago, much worse. "And where are you?" Sirio's voice softened. "Hiding among the silent gods, while your good sister struggles, your sister drowns, and your brother rages. You, Arya Stark, are no coward. Yet here you are, hiding." The words stung, and Arya hated that they did. "It's not fair," Arya murmured. Syrio did not respond. Instead he clasped his hands behind his back and stood there, staring down his beak of a nose at her. "It's not fair," Arya cried, louder this time, the words ripping out of her throat. "It's not fair." The tears came before she realized it. Her small fists pounded against Sirio's chest as she shouted the words again and again, each strike weaker than the last. She could not say when her fury dissolved into grief, when her screams broke into ragged sobs. At some point, Sirio's arms folded around her, firm but not unkind, and he let her bury her face in his chest. She did not know how long she cried. Time felt strange, as if the world beyond the September had slipped away. When her body had no more tears to give and her sobs dwindled into small, hiccuping breaths, Syrio finally eased her back. His dark eyes met hers, soft with sorrow, but unyielding. "Life is not fair, child," he said gently. "In this castle of stone and banners, you have not yet tasted that truth as the small folk do. They learn it early, in their hovels and fields. They learn that life takes more than it gives. But you," he grabbed her chin lightly so she would not look away, "you know it now." Arya swallowed, her throat raw, her chest aching. Syrio crouched before her, no longer towering above but eye to eye. "The world has dealt you a cruel blow, little wolf. You cannot change it. You cannot fight it with steel or fists. Grief is a storm that will drown you if you let it." His voice softened even further. "But you are Arya Stark. You must learn to walk through that storm. To let it sharpen you, not break you." Arya's lip trembled. She wanted to argue, to tell him she was only a girl, but no words came. Syrio tilted his head, studying her as if weighing her spirit. "Your mother would not want you lost in sorrow. She would want you to stand and to live." Arya sniffled, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. Syrio left her there. He had said his piece and now it was on her to decide how she would respond to his words. Another lesson. She took a few moments to gather herself. When she exited the September it was to Nymeria sitting there patiently for her. She scratched the direwolf behind the ear for a moment. "Bring me to Sansa," she instructed. Nymeria stood up and stretched before licking the side of Arya's face. "Ah," she cried, wiping at the saliva that coated her cheeks. Nymeria huffed in amusement before taking off in a trot. Arya followed, still swiping aggressively at her cheek. Nymeria padded ahead, tail swishing as she led her to the closed door of Sansa's room. Arya did not bother knocking. She threw the door open, where it slammed into the wall with a bang. If Sansa did not want to be disturbed, she would have locked it. Sansa's scream split the air, startled and high-pitched, before breaking into a strangled, furious, Arya. Lady, curled at the foot of the bed, lifted her silver head. Her lips peeled back in a low growl, not in a threatening way, but more in an annoyed way, her golden eyes flashing at the disruption. "You cannot just barge into my room like that." Sansa snapped, her face pale, her hands clutching the folds of her gown as if Arya had struck her. Arya planted herself in the doorway, arms crossed stubbornly over her chest. "Rickon needs us." Sansa blinked, still trembling from the shock. "What do you mean, Rickon needs us? Is he?" Her voice faltered. "Is he okay?" Arya snorted, sharp and bitter. "Are any of us okay?" The words hit their mark. Sansa's gaze fell to her hands. Arya noticed the rims of her sister's eyes, raw and red, the blotches on her cheeks poorly hidden. She had been crying, just as Arya had been earlier, though neither would admit it aloud. For a heartbeat, Arya hesitated. She did not know what to say, but Sirio's words rang in her ears. Arya swallowed hard, trying to keep the edge from her voice. "We're getting drowned in our grief." She paused, the words not quite sounding right, but pressed on anyway. "We're blind to everything else, especially Rickon." Her jaw tightened, but she pressed on. "He's a child, and we're leaving him to deal with Mother's death on his own." Lady gave a low whine and rested her head back on her paws. Sansa's lip quivered, though she fought to compose herself, lifting her chin in that way that always reminded Arya of their mother. Arya stared at her sister across the space of the chamber. For all their differences, she saw in Sansa the same hollowness she felt within herself. It took a moment, but Sansa took a deep breath and stood. "Let's go find Rickon." Lady jumped to her feet, nudging Sansa's hand with her nose. With trembling hands, her sister ran her fingers through Lady's fur as if to calm herself. Their direwolves seemed to know what was needed, for they took off without a word said to them. The two sisters fell into step behind them, neither saying a word. Through the corridors and courtyards they went, until they came upon the Godswood. The door to the Godswood was closed, and it was clear the servants were avoiding it, like they had been all those nights ago when Rickon had first started showing signs of being half wild, of having the wolf blood, as their father would call it. Arya pushed the door open, Nymeria and Lady darting into the Godswood first. She followed after them, Sansa bringing up the rear. It was still except for the ripple of the heart tree's leaves. The sun's waning light spilled through the branches, painting the clearing in gold. The growl came first, deep, feral, and wild enough to make Sansa flinch. Shaggydoak padded through some bushes, black fur bristling, eyes glowing green in the half-light. Nymeria stepped forward, hackles rising as her golden eyes fixed on him. Lady joined her, graceful even in her tension. The two sisters stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the direct route to Arya and Sansa. Shaggydoak charged and Nymeria surged forward to meet him. The sound of their collision was heavy and brutal, jaws snapping, paws striking stone and root. Nymeria braced herself against him, snarling, their bodies twisting together in a flurry of snapping teeth. Lady darted in from the side, snapping at Shaggydoak's flank to drive him back. Sansa clutched Arya's arm, whispering through clenched teeth. "He'll hurt them. He's mad." "No," Arya muttered, though her heart hammered in her chest. "They're just fighting." Shaggydoak whirled on Lady, his paw flashing across her muzzle, drawing a startled yelp. He pressed hard, driving Nymeria back into the roots of a tree, teeth catching in her scruff. He shook her once, twice, ragged snarls echoing through the Godswood. Arya nearly charged forward, but Sansa must have sensed it because she reached out with her hand and grabbed onto Arya's arm. Nymeria twisted free with a savage jerk, slamming her shoulder into Shaggydoke's chest. Lady was on him again in an instant, jaws flashing as she lunged for his foreleg, forcing him to stumble. Together, the two she-wolves circled him, biting at his flanks, driving him back step by step. The three wolves broke apart at last, breath steaming in the cold air. They stood in a wide triangle beneath the red leaves of the heart tree, growling, tails low and lashing. Lady let out a sharp, commanding bark that echoed through the godswood. Nymeria's growl joined hers. Shaggydoke's chest heaved, his foam-flecked muzzle wrinkled in defiance. For a long heartbeat, Arya thought he would spring again. But at last he dropped back a pace, still rumbling, his green eyes restless and wild. Sansa let out the breath she'd been holding. "He's not tame at all," she whispered. "Neither is he," Arya said, pointing at the bushes Shaggydoke had emerged from. Sansa's eyes looked to where she was pointing. She let out a gasp, hand letting go of Arya's arm as it flew to her mouth in shock. Rickon stood there covered in dirt and mud. His clothes were a mess, holes ripping the fabric, thread coming apart at the seams. Half of his hair was pressed down with mud while the other half stood up at odd angles. "Has he been sleeping in here?" Sansa asked. Arya could only shrug her shoulders. Bran 6. Gannon was single-minded in his focus, gripping onto the reins of Bran's horse as he led them forward. The clash of steel and the cries of men still echoed from behind them, carried on the wind, but Gannon never once looked back. Bran did, twisting in the saddle, but the haze and distance made it impossible to make out anything other than the general clashing of bodies. The stony September was a walled town, more sprawling than Wintertown with its clustered hovels, but nothing near the size of the cities of Westeros or the large towns that dotted the reach, places Bran had seen in his travels. The walls bore fresh scars of battle, soot stains, fallen stone, a jagged wound where the gate once stood. Black smoke curled high into the air. From afar the town looked abandoned, but as they drew near, they could faintly make out the frantic sounds of life on the other side. At the smashed open gate stood a boy, gangly and pale, gripping a pitchfork as though it were a knight's spear. His eyes darted from Bran to Gannon, but lingered longest on the shaggy direwolf padding silently at their side. Summer's yellow eyes gleamed, and the boy swallowed hard. "User Stark?" he asked at last, voice cracking. His chin jerked toward the wolf. "We've heard stories of wolves in battle." "I am Bran Stark," Bran said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Is the town safe?" Gannon pressed, his gaze sliding past the boy, searching the streets beyond the gate. "The mountains men ain't here no mo," the boy said, almost spitting the words, as if the taste of them was foul. "Lord Blackwood came with his banners. Drove them off." "We'll find an inn," Gannon muttered, his hand tightening on Bran's shoulder as though to reassure himself. "Hold there till Lord Jon comes for us." Bran almost corrected him. Jon was no lord, but swallowed the words. Jon had trusted Gannon with his safety because he trusted the hulking man. It was clear Gannon was loyal to Jon, outside of being a Stark man. The boy stepped aside, lowering his pitchfork. "Come on in," he muttered. "Not like I could stop you if I tried." Inside the gate, the full horror of the sack revealed itself. Bodies lay where they had fallen, armored men with Lannister crimson or Clegane's yellow hound upon their surcoats, others, more numerous, clad in the white catfish of House Shawnee. Not all were soldiers. Women sprawled in doorways, their dresses torn and blooded. Children too small to raise a blade had met the same fate, their stillness more haunting than anything else Bran had seen. The air stank of ash and blood. Homes and shops were little more than charred husks, their blackened beams still smoldering. Some fires raged on, defiant against the bucket lines of weary townsfolk who shouted hoarsely as they passed water hand to hand. Every street bore wounds, doors split from their hinges, windows smashed, the ground churned to mud by hooves and boots. With summer leading the way, the townspeople gave them a wide berth, not that they allowed themselves to be distracted from their task of putting out the fires. They were unable to find an inn that was not burned down or being drenched in water to fight lingering flames, and so Gannon led them to the September that sat atop a small hill. It was one of two large stone buildings in the town, the other being a holdfast at the base of the hill. The heavy wooden doors of the September still stood, though their surface was scored with deep gashes left by sword and axe. One of the doors was wide open and it appeared that it was the September where the wounded were being gathered to be cared for. A group of women did the best they could with the limited supplies they had, and a septon and 2 septars oversaw the work. The women stopped and stared at them when they entered. Or more specifically, they stared at Summer. Gannon directed Bran off to the side of the entrance, so they were not in the way of those rushing in and out. Bran didn't know how long they stood there before there was a great shouting from outside, more than the townsfolk scrambling to subdue the fires. There were frightened whispers about the Mountain returning, but Bran hoped not, because if the Mountain was coming back to finish off the town, that meant Jon, Sir Robar, and the rest of their party was likely dead. Then Small Jon burst into the September, carrying Jon in his arms and screaming for a Maester. They lingered at the stony September for 3 days, for that was how long it took Jon to stir to consciousness. His wound was ugly, and as deep as it was cruel. The cut had been cleaned with hot water and wine, sewn shut with a steady hand, and wrapped in linen steeped with poultices that smelled of pine resin and crushed herbs. Each day the bandages that were wrapped around most of Jon's head were peeled away, fresh salves applied, and the wound bound again. The Maester who did the work had been found cowering within the holdfast's only tower and might have stayed hidden until the stranger came for him, had Small Jon not threatened to pull the place down stone by stone. One of Clegane's brutes had tried to take Jon's head clean from his shoulders, but Ghost had appeared through the mass of bodies, tearing out the man's throat before the blow could fall true. Even so, the edge of the axe carved a vicious line from above Jon's ear, across his cheek, and down past his jaw, leaving a mark that would be carried for life. Small Jon had brought not only their own party to safety but what remained of the Blackwood men as well. Lord Blackwood and his master-at-arms had both perished in the battle, leaving their force bereft of command. Small Jon wasted no time, putting the survivors to work, dousing smouldering fires, clearing rubble, and dragging corpses from the streets before disease could take hold. There was no joy in the work, but the Blackwood men followed the giant Umber, if only because he gave them purpose. Stony September itself was rudderless. Sir Walbert Shawnee, younger brother to Lord Shawnee and the Castellan left to govern the town, had been cut down in the sack. With his death, no Shawnee remained in the town to rule, and the small folk looked upon the shattered walls and burned houses with vacant eyes, waiting for someone to tell them what would come next. Sir Adam did not make it. Sir Humphrey had whispered to Bran as they watched the Maester work on Jon, his head bowed low. The soft-spoken knight had been one of hundreds who would never rise again. Sir Adam Graves had longed for battle all his life, dreaming of glory, and it would be the only battle he would ever fight in. Bran had no words to answer Sir Humphrey, only silence. When at last they departed, the Blackwood men were left behind in the town they had bled for. Word had been sent to Lord Shawnee, and the new Lord Blackwood to decide the fate of both the town and the men who bore black ravens on their surcoats. Their own road turned north, slow and cautious, so that Jon could rest when the pain overcame him. Even so, each day Bran thought his brother looked paler, though he never spoke his worry aloud. Behind their party was a cart that carried a large wooden box, but no one would tell Bran what it held. By the time they came to Acorn Hall, the small keep with its orchards and pale stone walls, Robb was already there with his battle guard and a few other northern nobles, Great Jon, Lady Mage, Sir Willis Marndaly, Robert Glover, and Arlo Vowell. Bran. Before he could so much as think to dismount, his elder brother was there, pulling him down from his horse and crushing him in a fierce embrace. Robb smelled of leather and steel, and his arms were stronger, heavier than Bran remembered. For a heartbeat, Bran let himself be smothered in it, as though he were a boy again. But then he laughed, wriggling free of his brother's grip. "You worry worse than mother." At those words, Robb's smile faltered. Something passed over his face then, a look Bran had never seen before. "Bran, mother." Robb trailed off. There was a quiver in his voice. Bran felt his stomach roll and his limbs grow heavy. "Robb, what happened to mother?" Bran cried for hours, his face buried deep in Summer's fur. He did not care if it made him look weak in front of hardened warriors who had seen battle and death. Robb sat with him at first, hand on his shoulder, but duty pulled him away soon enough. In his place came Sir Robar Royce and Lady Brienne of Tarth, who stood nearby as silent sentinels, granting him the dignity to weep without shame. "Little Wolf," a gravelly voice called. Bran lifted his head, his eyes swollen and sore. Morgan Liddell stood before him, the mountain clansman's scarred face softened in a way Bran had never seen before. "The young wolf asks for you." Sir Robar stooped to help him up, steadying him as his legs wobbled beneath his small frame. Summer rose alongside him, pressing close. Together they followed Morgan through the hallways of Acorn Hall until they reached the chamber where Jon was resting. The door was ajar, and Bran could hear the voices within. "He was always too pretty," came Small Janumber's booming voice. "At least now folk might stop confusing him for a maid." "Ha!" Laughter rippled from inside, cut short by a strangled groan. "Fuck!" Jon hissed, his voice muffled with pain. "Don't make me laugh. Or talk." Morgan pushed the door open wider, nodding Bran inside. The little wolf, as asked for. The small bedchamber was already close to bursting. Jon lay on the bed, Ghost stretched out across his feet. Robb sat in the lone chair, grey wind curled loyally at his side, while Small Jon loomed near the door, filling the space with his sighs. When Bran and Summer entered, there was hardly room to move. "I'll leave you Starks to it," Small Jon said, stepping carefully over Summer's tail before closing the door behind him. Bran climbed onto the edge of the bed, Summer settling at his feet, while Robb leaned forward, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "We're sending you back to Winterfell," Robb said at last. "The new ladies Karstark and Mandaeally will soon depart Riverrun for their keeps, and you'll travel with them. It's safer that way." Bran nodded his head in understanding. While he had enjoyed being a page and learning about what it meant to be a knight, he knew it was not something that could last. He was not a squire, it was not his duty to accompany the knight he served into war. Sir Robar had honored his oath to Lord Eddard Stark by bringing Bran back safely to his kin, and now the Vale Knight would join the fighting. "We'll escort you to." "I've been having dreams," Bran blurted, cutting him off. Robb blinked, the briefest scowl tugging at his features at the interruption. Bran imagined his brother was not often cut off anymore, not since he had taken the mantle of command. "Tell us of them," Robb said after a pause. So Bran told them. Of the dreams of crows resting on a fist. Of an avalanche of snow and ice, and a white wolf coming with fire. He confessed that he had dreamed them almost nightly for moons but had spoken of them to no one. Then he told them of the new dream, a black horse with a red mane, a knight with rusted axes, 3 pine trees on a hilltop, and the sea rising higher and higher, threatening to drown them all. His words filled the small chamber. He saw his brothers exchange a look. "What?" Bran demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Robb's lips pressed thin. "We've long believed." Jon made a sound of disagreement, and Robb shot him a glare, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged mid-speech. It had been too long since Robb had been surrounded by his siblings, surrounded by those who knew him before he led armies. "We've long suspected," Robb emphasized the word with a look at Jon, "the direwolves are more than mere beasts. Gifts from the old gods, perhaps. Tied to us in ways deeper than we know. What you speak of though?" He trailed off, uncertain. "Greenseer," Jon muttered through clenched teeth. He patted his chest twice, then let his hand fall to Ghost's white fur. "The white wolf," Robb said in agreement. "Jon is the one in your first dream. But the crows? And the fist in the snow?" Bran pressed. "You've spent too long in the south," Robb teased gently. "What do they call the Brothers of the Watch?" "Crows," Bran muttered, flushing at his forgetfulness. "And the fist?" Robb shrugged. "Something the Watch might know the meaning of. But it sounds to me like Jon is meant to save them, at least some of them, from whatever storm is coming." Bran turned to Jon, who only shrugged, his dark eyes unreadable. "And the second dream?" Robb rubbed his jaw. "The black horse for Ryswell, the rusted axes for Dustin, the pine trees for Tallheart, and the armored knight could be Glover. All the houses that border the Sunset Sea." He frowned. "Perhaps a flood." Jon grunting his agreement with the guess, but offered no more than that. The sea rising higher than the land was an omen none of them understood. That night, they feasted in the great hall. Lady Smallwood, left behind to rule Acorn Hall while her husband and sons fought in the war, did not sit with them, but her household set a fine spread for the guests. Bran sat at the high table between Robb and Jon. Jon had removed his wrappings, revealing the angry welt of red and purple swelling, the harsh black stitching that held his torn flesh together. Bran pondered on what Jon had grunted earlier, about him being a greenseer. He remembered the stories old Nan would tell of them. The children of the forest had the gift, and it was rumored that after the war between the children and the first men, that there had been children born to both, passing the gift into the line of first men. Could Bran truly be a greenseer? My lords! Great Jon shouted, interrupting Bran from his thoughts. The giant of a man rose to his full height, a tankard clutched loosely in his hand. The Northmen, who were often rowdy once they were in their cups, quieted down in an instant. Jon blinked, caught off guard by how quickly the merriment went silent, his eyes darting from the man to the hushed faces around him. Beside him, Robb straightened in his chair, sensing something was off, both of his hands splayed upon the table as if bracing himself for whatever was to come. Then there were the non-Northmen in the room. Theon Greyjoy glanced around with a raised brow, plainly bemused by the sudden hush. Across from him, Sir Winfrey shifted uncomfortably, his younger brother Oliver whispering a question he did not have the answer to. Lucas Blackwood, seated not far from them, leaned forward in wary silence, trying to read the mood that seemed to ripple through the northern lords. Bran's companions from Storm's End, who sat separate from the rest, feeling like outsiders to those who had fought numerous battles together, glanced around uneasily. Knowing he had the entire room's attention, Great Jon continued. Stannis Baratheon is nothing to me. What does he know of the Wall or the Wolfswood or the barrows of the first men? What does he know of wilderling raids and snowfall as tall as a man? And don't get me started on the thrice-damned Lannisters. The others take the bloody lot of them. It was the dragons we married, and the dragons are all dead. Great Jon downed the rest of his tankard in one gulp before slamming it down on the table in front of him. Droplets of ale ran down his beard and dripped onto his leather armor, but the man paid them no mind. No, Robb whispered, only loud enough for Jon and Bran to hear him. The White Wolf captured the Kingslayer. He took the Golden Tooth and killed the Mountain. The Northmen shouted their approval. The young wolf led us to victory at the Whispering Woods and the Battle of the Camps. Great Jon continued, stepping closer to the high table. He led us in the massacre at Oxcross and captured Sarsfield without losing a man. More roars of approval. Great Jon reached over his shoulder and unsheathed his great sword from his back. He pointed the blade at the high table. Bran looked at his brothers, still unclear where this was going. Jon looked like he was going to be sick. Robb was paler than normal and was slowly shaking his head while softly mouthing the word no over and over again. There sits the only family I mean to bend my knee to. And Great Jon did just that, getting to a knee and laying his sword down on the floor in front of the high table. The Kings of Winter. The Kings of the North. Mage Mormont moved next to the kneeling Lord Umber and grabbed her spiked mace from her belt. She too knelt down and laid her mace next to the sword. The Kings of the North. Soon every northerner in the room was on one knee, with their weapons on the floor in front of them: Sir Willis Marndale, Robert Glover, Ollo Val, Morgan Liddell, Torren Carstark, Roderick Forrester, Daisy Mormont, Hoarfrost Umber, and Owen Norrie. Without hesitation Theon knelt to the ground with his sword in front of him. He was joined by, of all people, Sir Robar Royce. The rest of the non-northerners stayed seated, watching in stunned silence as if they were witnessing the opening of a wound that would bleed the kingdoms dry. The Kings in the North. The Kings in the North. The Kings in the North. Chapter 48, Jon 12. Jon 12. The whole had fallen silent under the weight of what had just happened. This was not just some one-off that could be ignored or easily dismissed. There was the lord or heir to most of the major houses in the north kneeling before them: Carstark, Mormont, Umber, Glover, Marndale, and Val, the strongest of the mountain clans. The only two of the major houses that were missing were the Boltons, with Roose leading the northern forces at Harrenhal, and the Reeds, who had been tasked with guarding the neck from any southern armies. Jon felt his stomach knot. He cast a glance toward Robb, and the look on his brother's face confirmed the same realization. Robb's features were set in stone, but his eyes burned in anger. Grey Wind, Robb murmured, make sure there's no one listening who should not be. Jon gave a sharp nod to Ghost. The White Wolf rose and made his way to the closest door out of the room. Grey Wind padded after him, claws clicking against the stone. From his seat, Bran stirred, his face pale. Go, Summer, he urged, and the third direwolf leapt down to join his kin. If they were fortunate, no ears beyond this hole would hear what had just been spoken. Rob stood, leaning forward on his hands that rested on the table. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking with the demand. "Why are you doing this?" The great Jon lifted his head, confusion knitting his brow. "Why? It's time the North rules itself again." His voice boomed through the rafters, echoing against stone. "We've bent the knee for centuries, and what have we gained for it? The Ironborn raid our coasts, burn our villages, steal our people, and the Iron Throne does nothing. But let a field in the Reach go up in flames, or some ships in the Westerlands burn, and the whole realm marches to defend them." He slammed his fist against the stone floor. "Wildlings cross the wall to raid our homes, raise some fool king beyond the wall, and it's the Starks who ride to put them down. Always the Starks. Always the North, bleeding and dying under crown that does not care." Rob's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles blanched white. "And what have you done now?" he shot back, his voice rising above the murmurs. "You've put my father's life in greater peril than ever before. He is no longer a rebellious lord to be pardoned, no vassal they might welcome back into the fold. You've made him a king. A king who would tear this realm asunder." The lord stirred uneasily, but Rob pressed on, his fury driving him. "Who do you think is worth more in trade, a high lord who can bend the knee, or a man whose vassals made him king?" The lords shifted on their knees, some muttering, some frowning, none willing to rise. "You wish to raise House Stark up as the kings of winter, as we once were for thousands of years, so be it. But you will speak to it of no one who does not already know. It will be nothing more than a whisper of the wind outside of these halls. Spoken when the only ones listening are you and the gods, is that understood?" "Aye, my prince," Lady Mage said. Jon grimaced at the title, falling from the lips of a northern noble so easily. He had not missed how the northern lords knelt before them almost as if they were one. This had been planned, and the planning had likely been done over the course of months. "I wish to be alone with my brothers," Rob said. All those who had bent the knee now rose, the sound of boots scuffing against stone echoing in the hall. One by one the Northmen filed out, their heads held high, spines stiff with conviction. Not a single one of them showed hesitation or regret. Sir Royce was quickly intercepted by Sir Humphrey and Sir Reynold, the two knights leaning in close, their voices low. From the sharp gestures it was plain they were pressing him with questions, seeking answers in the wake of what they had just witnessed. Lady Brian followed in their shadow, her long stride more subdued. The three Freys, Sir Pewin, Oliver, and Brian, drifted together with Lucas Blackwood. They moved quickly, heads inclined toward one another as they talked in hushed whispers. And then there was Theon. He lingered, eyes flicking toward Rob with a questioning look. Jon knew what that look meant. Was he included among those brothers Rob wished to be left with? But Rob did not so much as shift his gaze. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed firmly on the table before him. Theon's face twisted into a sullen scowl, and he trudged from the hall with the heavy gait of a man dismissed. It became plain, as the last of the men departed, that Rob did not want to talk with Jon and Bran. He had only wanted the hall emptied so that he might sit with his anger. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of claws scratching against stone as the direwolves padded back into the chamber. Ghost slipped to Jon's side, Summer to Bran, and Grey Wind settled near Rob. Based on the lack of screams, there had been no servants outside the halls listening in. It was Bran who finally broke the silence, his voice uncertain. "Does this mean I cannot be a Kingsguard?" Jon turned his head, one brow arched. His little brother flushed, squirming as though he wished to take the question back. Rob blinked, startled out of his anger by the question. "If the North breaks away from the other kingdoms," Rob said, his voice steady, "then no, you likely will not be a Kingsguard." Bran's face crumpled at the words, his boyhood dream suddenly out of reach. Rob cleared his throat and leaned forward. "But we will have our own Kingsguard. Men sworn to protect the king in the north." Ghost pressed his muzzle into Jon's hand. Absent-mindedly, Jon scratched behind the wolf's ear. "Wolfsguard," Jon corrected. The movement pulled at the torn skin along his face, a searing pain that made him wince despite himself. "If the North even stays independent," Rob added. When father is free, he will likely do away with this nonsense of an independent North, and we will either back Stannis' claim or we will return to the North and sit out the rest of the conflict. Jon agreed with Robb, but there was a part of him that wondered. What if he doesn't, he asked, doing his best to limit the movement of his jaw as he talked. If we stayed independent? Robb asked, looking at him in surprise. Jon gave a slow nod. He remembered boyhood days spent with Robb, wooden swords in hand as they pretended they were fighting wars or ruling kingdoms. And now here they were, almost men, and they were not pretending. We would need more ships to defend our coast. And a fleet on the western shores, Robb said, after some thought. The Ironborn would grow more bold if we stood on our own, and I do not think Theon's safety would keep them at bay for long. A standing army, Jon said. No waiting months to march to war. Robb mulled the idea over. He knew better than most what a pain it was to gather the northern host. It had taken him months to rally the army at Winterfell, and even then they had left 2 weeks before the Karstark and Northern Mountain clans had arrived. The two of them spoke long into the night, mapping a kingdom that did not yet truly exist, with duties and burdens that neither had ever truly considered until now. They might have gone on until dawn, but Bran, who sat watching them in silence, slumped forward at last, dozing in his chair. He nearly toppled before Summer nudged him steady with his muzzle, earning a faint smile even in slumber. Robb rose quietly then, scooping Bran into his arms and ending the talk. The future would wait for the morning. The next day, their party set out for Riverrun. Robb sent a rider ahead with letters, one of them meant for the Wall, a request of Lord Commander Mormont for news of the Night's Watch. The journey took a week. Robb pressed to keep the pace gentle, for Jon's sake, though Jon would have none of it. A wound to the head was not a missing limb. His skin was split and the flesh was tender, but he was not some invalid. He took the place at the head of the column, setting the pace, his back stiff with defiance. There was another reason he preferred the front. It spared him Bran's long silences, those moments when grief seemed to overwhelm him. Jon knew he should ride at his brother's side to offer comfort and lend an ear. Yet he could not. He did not want Bran to see his own face dry of tears and grief. Jon was saddened, but he was saddened for his siblings who had just lost a mother. Saddened for his father, who had lost the woman he loved. For Lady Catelyn herself there was no grief inside him. She had spared him outright cruelty, but she had spared him kindness as well. And that truth left him filled with guilt. To not grieve the mother of his siblings, made him feel monstrous. Riverrun was as Jon remembered it. Lord Edmure was there to greet them as they rode through the gates, flanked by the Blackfish, Lord Shawnee, and Lord Brynden Blackwood. All three had returned upon hearing grim tidings, Sir Brynden for the death of his beloved niece, Lord Shawnee for his brother, and Brynden Blackwood for his father. Before they had even dismounted, Robb requested a private audience. Jon was asked to join. After a pause, Robb extended the same invitation to Lord Brynden. Once Lord Edmure's solar door was shut behind them, Robb wasted no time. My asking to speak with you is for 2 reasons. Jon braced himself. He knew exactly where this was headed. It had been decided on the ride south that the raising of House Stark to kingship and the North's break from the Iron Throne, while best kept from the rest of Westeros, could not be hidden from their closest ally. Honor demanded they tell House Tully, whether they welcomed the news or not. The Riverlands had fought and bled alongside them. As for Brynden Blackwood, his younger brother already knew, and the Blackwoods were tied even closer to the north with Brynden's betrothal to Sansa. Robb's words fell into the chamber like stones cast into still water. Lord Edmure was the first to speak. His face flushed as anger rose up in him. This is folly, he said. A dangerous folly. If the North alone secedes, it weakens us all. Do you not see what this means for the Riverlands? Already we fight the Lannisters, but now we are allies with secessionists. We will bleed no matter who sits the Iron Throne. My people will pay for decisions not our own. Do you think I asked for this, uncle? Robb responded, jaw tight as he did his best to rein in his anger. The Northern Lords bent the knee to House Stark. They named us kings before I had time to open my mouth, and had I refused them, I might have lost their swords. My father is still their true lord, but he is a prisoner of the Lannisters. I cannot free him with half an army splintering away in anger. His hand clenched into a fist against the table. We did not seek a crown, but I cannot throw it back in their faces, not now. The Blackfish had listened in silence, arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. At last, he spoke with a weary sigh. Edmure's right about one thing, this makes your uncle's position worse, not better. Riverrun will be squeezed from both sides. But the realm has rarely served the Riverlands well. The Starks have always ruled their own, crown or no crown. It is not for me to cheer or condemn. His tone was even, almost detached, but his eyes lingered on Robb. Robb gave him a curt nod, though his shoulders sagged a little. Jon knew Robb was hoping the Blackfish would offer more in support, even if he did not agree. Brynden Blackwood, however, leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes alive. "It is bold," he said, his lips curling into a smile. "Bold, and just. The North has always been its own in spirit, if not in law. Perhaps it is time others remembered the same. Many in the Trident are weary of a crown that ignores us until they need our swords. When war breaks out in the realm, the Riverlands always suffer. You have the support of House Blackwood." Edmure gaped at him. "Support? You would drag us into rebellion." "No," Brynden replied smoothly. "I would honor a truth already made. The North is free. That choice has been set. The question now is whether Riverrun stands with them." Edmure sputtered. The Blackfish merely leaned back, silent again, as though watching to see which way the winds might turn. Robb's gaze dropped to the table. "I do not ask the Riverlands to rise with us," he said, his voice low. "This crown was thrust upon us, not claimed. When my father is freed, he will decide if the North is a kingdom or not. Until then, we will wear it because we must." His eyes lifted, clear and tired, to his uncle's. "But I will not drag you into this. The Riverlands will answer to Riverrun, as they always have. All I ask is that you speak of this to no one." With an oath from each that they would not speak of it, Robb turned toward the other matter he wished to discuss. "Even with our victories over the Lannisters, we still do not hold much of a numerical advantage when the Crown land houses are added to the mix," Robb said, his tone grim. His fingers drummed lightly against the table. "We need more allies. Lysa has ignored every missive sent to her," Edmure reminded, lips twisting as though the very thought of his sister left a bitter taste. "She shuts herself up in the Eyrie. I would not count on her for any assistance." "You will not find one in Stannis either," the Blackfish said with a snort. "He wants to be king and will not stomach the North's independence. He is a stubborn man who does not yield. You are more likely to find an enemy in him than an ally." Robb inclined his head, acknowledging the truth in their words. "I was thinking farther south. With Renly dead, many in the Reach are still leaderless. A few have bent the knee to Stannis, but the Tyrells hold back, and with them most of the strength of the Reach. If we offered them a marriage to a Lord Paramount," here Robb's eye slid to Edmure, "mayhaps we can secure their swords." The Blackfish chuckled, though it lacked any trace of humor. He reached across and gave Edmure a comradely pat on the shoulder. "Your father spent near half his life trying to see you wed." Edmure grimaced and a resigned sigh escaped him. "I suppose it's time I wed and beget heirs of my own. I had hoped for love, or at least choice, but life rarely waits for either." "It is said Margaery Tyrell is the most beautiful maid in the realm," Brynden Blackwood put in, his face alight with enthusiasm. Then, realizing the looks both Robb and Jon were giving him, he blurted, "After Lady Sansa, of course." Ghost, who had been sprawled lazily at Jon's feet, rose and padded over to Brynden Blackwood with deliberate steps. The direwolf sat beside him and loosed an exaggerated yawn that showed every sharp white fang. Brynden stiffened, throat working audibly as he gulped. Jon smirked, amused at his direwolf's impeccable sense of timing. Robb cleared his throat, pushing past the moment. "Will you lead the envoy, uncle?" Jon thought it a clever move. Edmure Tully was no great general, but he was personable and charming. He was also a comely man, sharing the same coloring and many of the same facial features of Robb. Add all that onto his position as a Lord Paramount and he was the perfect representative to the Reach. "My people need me," Edmure protested. "They are still in danger. The Lannisters have been driven from the Riverlands," the Blackfish pointed out. They do not have enough men to put together a sizable force in the west, and Tywine will not march onto our lands again with our army at Harrenhal looming, not until he deals with Stannis and can fold the Stormlands back under the Iron Throne. Edmure's resistance faltered, and after a long pause he nodded. Robb seized the moment. I would have my good father, Sir Willis, accompany you to speak for the North. He has been made aware that the betrothals of Arya, Bran, and Rickon are all on the table if needed to seal a pact. That stung Jon more than he liked to admit. The thought of his younger siblings bartered like coin set his teeth on edge. It was the way of things, and in moments like this, he was glad of his bastard status. No one would bargain for the right to wed a bastard. Having the Reach's armies at our side will tip the war in our favor, Edmure admitted. Not just the Reach, Jon grunted out through gritted teeth. 3 sets of eyebrows raised as they looked between him and Robb. What do you mean? Edmure asked. We mean to send a gift to Dorne, Robb replied. At once, the Blackfish let out another humorless chuckle. Dorne. You'd be better off asking the Wall for knights. The Martells remember Elia and her children well. Overthrowing the dragons led to their deaths. You'll find no warmth there. Robb shook his head. An atrocity committed by Lannisters, one my father loudly condemned. And one of the responsible beasts lies dead now, slain by the son of Eddard Stark. Brynden Blackwood's eyes brightened at that, leaning forward, his eagerness momentarily overcoming his unease with Ghost beside him. How did you do it? He asked, almost breathless. I rode a horse into him. Then I took a mace to his head. Brynden sat back, blinking, as if trying to reconcile Jon's quiet delivery with the brutal image it conjured. The Blackfish gave Jon a long, considering look, before nodding his head in respect. Ghost padded back to Jon's side to lay down once more. We will send them the Mountain's corpse as an opening gift in negotiations, Robb explained. I will offer the help in righting the wrongs done to Princess Elia and her children by House Lannister. Amory Lorque is known to have killed Princess Rhaenys, and my father always believed the atrocities were done not of free will but on Tywine Lannister's orders. Which has never been proven, the Blackfish pointed out. And you think that will be enough? Lord Edmure asked, leaning forward in his chair. Not to secure an alliance, but it should be enough to bring them to the table. The next day the great hall of Riverrun filled with those who knew of the return of the Kings of Winter. Robb sat at the center of the high seat, Jon to his left, Bran to his right. Behind them stood Stark guardsman Kennett, tall and thin, a folded bundle of grey cloth cradled carefully in his arms in place of his spear. You have raised the Starks once more as kings in the North, Robb declared, his voice carrying through the hall. Now, more than ever, the Iron Throne will prize a Stark's life more dead than alive. The kings of old had their sworn shields, and so shall we. We are not knights, most of us follow the old gods, but honor and duty are not the sole possessions of the faith. It only means we do not believe a man must swear off women to protect a king, Jon added, his voice rough with pain but edged with humor. The effort cost him, but the flash of laughter and hooting from the gathered Northmen made it worthwhile. Nor do we believe such service must be for life, Robb said, a faint smile touching his lips. Bran straightened in his seat, his voice high but steady. Many of you have already fought beside my brothers, risking your lives to shield theirs. We would be honored to have such courage bound to us by oath. We name these 6 to form the first of our Wolfsguard: Torrhen Karstark, Owen Norrie, Morgan Liddell, Hoarfrost Umber, Roderick Forrester, and Daisy Mormont. Come forth. The 6 stepped from the crowd, each of them already aware they would be called, and knelt before the sons of Eddard Stark. But before Robb could speak again, more movement stirred the hall. Sir Robar Royce rose from his bench and went to one knee. He was followed swiftly by Sir Winfrey, then Sir Humphrey Hightower, Sir Rhaenyra Osgrey, and Lady Brienne of Tarth. A low murmur swept through the gathered Northmen as the Southerners knelt among them. House Royce and House Stark have shared blood and friendship since the first men, Sir Robar said, bowing his head. I am a second son, with no claim and no need of one. Let my sword find purpose here, guarding the blood of the Kings of Winter. Sir Winfrey spoke next. My kin have been scattered to the Wall, the Citadel, and the Faith. Even with that I am too far down the line of succession to be of worth to the twins. As one of your Wolfsguard, I can find meaning. The other 3 spoke of the same wants, proving themselves and finding a purpose. Jon caught Rob's eye and saw the same surprise mirrored there. They had planned for a dozen, maybe 15 sworn shields at most, expecting to fill the rest of the ranks slowly over weeks. Instead, the Wolf's Guard was nearly fully born in a single afternoon. Robb rose to his feet, his voice firm. Each of you will swear loyalty to House Stark and the North. But know this, our grandfather and uncle died under the watch of oath-breakers who called themselves true. If ever an order is given that violates the laws of gods or men, you have the right to refuse it. The Wolf's Guard are not blind swords. You are the shields of House Stark, and no king has the right to demand dishonor of his shield. One by one the chosen warriors spoke their oaths before those gathered. Kennett stepped forward, offering the cloaks, light grey trimmed in white, fastened with a silver brooch shaped like a direwolf's head. Robb, Jon, and Bran each took a cloak and draped it across the shoulders of their new protectors. When the ceremony ended and the hall had emptied of cheers and vows, the plans they had discussed were put into motion. The next morning, beneath a cold grey sky, Edmure Tully gathered the Northern Lords to witness the signing of his will. With a steady hand and a face taut with resolve, he named Bran heir to House Tully until such time as Edmure himself sired a child. That meant if Edmure died without a child, the Riverlands would, by default, fold into the North's kingdom. Once the ink had dried, Edmure wasted no time. He departed the castle with Sir Willis and a picked escort of 20 seasoned men, their banners snapping in the cold wind as they rode south. Their destination was Bitterbridge, last known mustering ground of Renly Baratheon's host. There, among the restless Reach lords and their fractured allegiances, Edmure would seek an alliance that might tip the balance of the war. Bran's journey was home. His brother joined 2 small companies preparing to ride for the White Knife and beyond, the party of Roslyn Karstark and that of Tytor Mandaeli. Roslyn would travel with her brother, Sir Benfrey Free. The combined group's path would first lead to the Twins where Sir Benfrey would retrieve his wife and kids, before they would continue north, Tytor to White Tower, Roslyn and Sir Benfrey to Carhold. Bran's own escort of Torrhen Karstark, Roderick Forrester, and Lady Brienne of Tarth, would see him safely to Moat Cailin and then beyond to Winterfell. Bran was tasked with delivering sealed decrees to those whose loyalty mattered most. One letter carried the direwolf of Stark to Lord Howland Reed of Greywater Watch, another to Steward Leopold Tallheart of Moat Cailin, each commanding awareness of northern independence. Jon's road led a different way, down the Red Fork, toward the sea. He would travel by riverboat to Solpants with small Jon Umber, Dacy Mormont, his young squire Brian Free, and 2 of the Stark guards, Kennett and Gannon. In another boat that would travel with them was the corpse of Sir Gregor Clegane, wrapped and bound, an offering of proof and vengeance. Mage Mormont and Harry on Karstark rode in grim escort, each with a pair of their own men for protection. At Solpants 2 ships of the Mandaeli trading fleet would be waiting. One would take Jon to Eastwatch by the sea, where the watch had written that Lord Commander Mormont and 300 men had ridden in a great ranging beyond the wall. The other would sail to Dorne by way of Pentos, hopefully escaping notice of the rising fleet activity taking place around Dragonstone. "Give the others my love," Jon said, as he hugged Bran. He could feel Bran's head nod against his chest. "Hopefully, we will be home soon. And father will be with us." Jon released his younger brother and turned toward Robb, who extended his hand. They clasped forearms. "Do not do anything stupid beyond the wall. It would be embarrassing if the man who killed the Mountain died by slipping on a patch of ice," Robb said, a wide smile splitting his face. "I promise not to do anything stupid if you promise not to lose the war while I am gone." Chapter 49, Robb 13. Robb 13. With Bran bound for the safety of the North, Jon off to investigate Bran's troubling visions at the wall, and the 2 envoys on their way to court alliances and much-needed men, Robb decided it was time to make a bolder move. He had been stationary in the Riverlands for too long. Before talking with the knights that came with Bran from the south, he had been planning to gather all of his host and see about forcing a confrontation with Tywin Lannister and then moving on King's Landing. However, everything pointed to Stannis Baratheon marching north from the Stormlands. While Robb did not consider the man an enemy, he did not know what would happen should their armies come across each other. Would Stannis demand northern allegiance and attack if he was rebuffed? Many made it seem like to the middle Baratheon who claimed to be king, you were either a subject or an enemy, there was no ground in between. Better to not risk a potential confrontation. From the Solar of Riverrun he wrote to Lord Bolton, telling him to help set Maidenpool to rights after it was raided by the Lannisters and to conduct raids against the Crown land houses that bordered the lands of Harrenhal. Then he drafted a raven to King's Landing. He did not ask for peace or that Tywin Lannister accept responsibilities for the war he had started. Instead, all he asked for was an exchange of prisoners. He wanted his father back, and he wanted it done before word of a possible independent North reached Joffrey's ears. Robb made sure to point out his position of strength in the letter. He reminded the Lannisters that the North held far more Westerland captives than the Lions did of the North or the Riverlands. Outside of Lord Eddard, the only notable hostages known to be in Lannister hands were Lord Raymond d'Arry, his young Eorman, and Lady d'Arry. When Roose Bolton had seized Harrenhal, they had expected to find the d'Arrys wasting in its dungeons, but the only prisoners discovered in those damp and dark cells were gaunt Northmen and Rivermen, common soldiers taken captive during the many skirmishes that had taken place. Robb's message named Sarsfield as the place where a reply should be sent, a deliberate choice. Sarsfield stood as a reminder of how deep Northern and Riverland banners now reached into the Westerlands, proof of victories the Lions had failed to check. With the Raven sent and no more reason to linger, Robb gathered his battle guard, many of whom were now members of the Wolfsguard, and rode west to the Golden Tooth. There they would be joined by the Riverland host marching from Raventree Hall, a force that had left days earlier but faced a longer road. The plan was ambitious. With the Riverlands army joining the forces already plundering the Westerlands, they would be able to seize the larger castles in the northern Westerlands. It would also allow them to send a sizable host into the southern Westerlands, towards the lands of Clegane and Swyft, to continue to bleed the Lannisters of grain, gold, and morale. It would also allow Robb to deliver a crushing blow. He planned on storming Lannisport, or rather he planned on having the Riverland army storm Lannisport. The Riverlands had burned because of the Lannisters, and he was sure many of the men wished to enact the same upon the Westerlands. At the Golden Tooth, Robb found Lord Steffon Free in firm control of the captured castle. Steffon reported no trouble with the servants or the Lefford men-at-arms, who lacked access to any weapons. His own 200 free guards maintained a steady watch that discouraged defiance, and many of the wounded from the storming of the keep were ready to join the fighting again. Most surprising of all was the treatment of Lady Alysanne Lefford. Steffon had allowed her to retain the Lord's chambers and a measure of authority within the keep. She could not send ravens or dispatch riders, but within those limits even the free soldiers treated her as second in command after Steffon, within reason of course. Later, in private, Steffon admitted that these concessions were calculated. Perhaps, he suggested with a sly half-smile, such courtesies might win Lady Alysanne's favor. Whether for the cause of the North and Riverlands, or for reasons more personal, as the woman would need a matrilineal marriage to continue her line, he left unsaid. Robb caught the implication but chose not to press. While they waited for the Riverlands host to arrive, a lone rider came from Riverrun carrying several letters sealed with wax stamped by northern houses. The man looked near ready to fall from his saddle, and the news he bore was no lighter. Upon reading them, Robb felt his stomach drop. He turned to Hoarfrost Umber, the Wolfsguard who stood guard behind him. "Fetch Theon," Robb said quietly, "and the Wolfsguard. Gather them all in the Lord's Solar." 10 minutes later, Robb sat behind the desk meant for Lord Lefford, or rather his daughter now since the man had been killed without any sons. 6 members of the Wolfsguard stood in attendance. Owen Norrie and Sir Humphrey Hightower flanked the window behind Robb, Sir Robar Royce and Morgan Liddell stood at the door, Sir Pewin Free and Sir Rayner Osgrey lingered to one side, quiet and watchful. Besides their matching cloaks, pinned with the silver direwolf of House Stark, it was hard to tell they were all part of the same order of protectors. Sir Humphrey and Sir Rayner wore plate armor in bright colors. The rest, including Sir Robar whose armor was stolen from Renly Baratheon's tent and was given armor by Robb, wore chainmail and leather, a mixture of blacks, browns, and greys. Robb briefly wondered if it would be wise to make matching suits of armor for them all. The door opened again and Theon entered, Hoarfrost at his back. He slowed when he saw who was gathered. "Did something happen?" Theon asked, cautiously moving forward toward the desk. Robb gestured to one of the chairs in front of him and waited for Theon to slowly sit. "We have news about the Ironborn. Are they joining the war?" Theon asked, a hint of eagerness creeping into his voice. "We should write my father for an alliance. The Iron Fleet can take Lannisport from the sea, while we take it from the land. Let me. They have joined the war, but not as you think, Robb interrupted, lips tight. The Iron Fleet has been spotted in Blazewater Bay and the Sunset Sea. Ironborn have been seen raiding the Rills, the Stony Shore, Sea Dragon Point, and the Wolf's Wood. Theon's face went white, and he looked at the Wolf's Guard with new fear in his eyes. Robb. Theon tried to say something, but the words caught in his throat. 11 years ago, Robb began, his voice low and steady, your father raised his banners against the king. His rebellion was crushed, his fleet burned, and his castle taken. To keep him from rising again, King Robert made you my father's ward, though we all knew what it truly meant. You were to die if Balon Greyjoy ever raised the Iron Fleet again. No one in the room moved. The only sound was the faint creak of leather as Theon shifted in his chair. A bead of sweat ran down his temples.